Order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on respecting artists with the American Music Fairness Act. Before we begin, I would like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating any exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you'd like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has previously been distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as possible. I would also ask all members to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Music has the power to bring people together. Now more than ever, as we continue to seek means of staying connected amid a global pandemic, people are turning to music to enjoy and to participate in a sense of social belonging. Music has also brought us together today to reflect on one of the most long-standing injustices that unfortunately has been a feature of the music landscape for decades: the ability of AM/FM broadcasters to play music without paying the performing artists a royalty. Unlike all other music platforms, terrestrial radio is allowed to use and to profit off the creation, the intellectual property of the artists for absolutely free. I am aware of no other instance in which this is allowed, and it is time for this unfairness to end. While granting this exemption to broadcasters has been grossly unfair for decades, its impact has become increasingly inequitable over time as the shape of the industry has changed. 4 years ago, Congress and the music community came together to pass the bipartisan Orrin Hatch Bob Goodlatte Music Modernization Act, a landmark piece of legislation bringing much needed updates to many aspects of the copyright system governing music. It's time to complete that project by passing another bipartisan measure, the American Music Fairness Act, introduced by Representatives Deutsch and Issa, which would at last require AM/FM radio stations to pay royalties for the recordings that they broadcast. I thank both Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Issa for their leadership on this issue, and as a longtime advocate for closing this unfair loophole that harms artists, I'm proud to join them in this effort. For years, broadcasters have argued that they should not have to pay a performance royalty because their airplay holds promotional value that leads to artists fair compensation through album sales, tour interests, and publicity. Although this has always been a dubious claim, the advent of popular digital media and streaming platforms has now made this argument progressively less relevant. Terrestrial, satellite, and digital radio all play the same music to the same audience on the same speakers. Critically, it's also clear that it is through these new digital platforms that a lot of new music discovery takes place today. In other words, these new services play just as important a role in music promotion, yet only they are required to pay this performance royalty. This puts the streaming services, and especially satellite and internet radio, at a competitive disadvantage to terrestrial radio. Simply put, similar businesses should be treated similarly under the law. Additionally, the failure of US law to establish a performance right on terrestrial radio means that our singers and other musicians miss out on royalties when their music is broadcast overseas. Nearly every other developed nation in the world compensates performers for playing their music on terrestrial radio. But since we do not have a similar performance right at home, American artists do not receive royalties when their music is played abroad. This deprives US artists of up to $200 million annually. The lack of a performance right costs our economy millions of dollars each year. But at bottom, this is an issue about fairness to artists, which is why I am so thankful that we will be hearing from 3 accomplished artists today to help us better understand how this issue impacts our country's enormous and diverse body of musicians. While every artist deserves to be paid when their music is used by broadcasters, this royalty stream would be particularly meaningful for the thousands of working-class artists who are a critical part of our country's vibrant music industry. It would also be particularly meaningful for artists who are not readily able to tour and perform. And this, unfortunately, has been the case for all artists over the past 2 years during the COVID pandemic. It is time once and for all to create a system that is platform neutral and that respects artists. We have an impressive range of witnesses here today, and I look forward to their testimony as we explore this critical issue. Before I yield back, without objection, I will enter into the record several statements of support we have received about the American Music Fairness Act, including from the Department for Professional Employees of the AFL-CIO.
Hello, anybody?
Kupferschmidt, CEO of the Copyright Alliance. Meredith Rose, Senior Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge. Mike Huppy, President and CEO of Sound Exchange, and 6 organizations representing community broadcasters. Without objection, I will also enter into the record documentation from each administration going back to President Carter, showing that all of them advised that the creation of this performance right would be in the best interest of the United States. I understand that the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, will be unable to participate in today's hearing, and that the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, will serve as ranking member for this hearing. Therefore, I now recognize Mr. Shabbat for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this morning's hearing, and thank you to the witnesses who will be testifying. This committee handles some of the most contentious issues facing Congress. Now, on many of those issues, abortion, gun control, how to deal with illegal immigration, you can count on virtually all the Democrats lining up on one side and all the Republicans lining up on the other side. But the topic of discussion today, intellectual property rights, specifically with respect to the music industry, is different. You really do see a lot of bipartisanship, cooperation, even compromise. I hope that trend continues as we consider legislation which could forever change the way in which music is enjoyed on the radio. Back in 2019, Mr. Chairman, you and then ranking member Collins circulated a Dear Colleague letter, which noted that radio royalties need to be handled through, quote, consensus-based proposals that move the American marketplace forward, and market realities should be taken into account. And I'd ask that unanimous consent that that Dear Colleague letter be entered into the record. Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Thank you. Currently, the 9 largest radio stations combined have a market cap of less than $4 billion, while the 3 largest record companies have a market cap over $200 billion. As this committee and Congress considers this issue, we need to be cautious that our actions don't further endanger broadcasters, particularly when it's estimated that they provide billions of dollars of promotional value to artists like Ms. Estefan, Mr. Mitchell, and Mr. Pomeroy, who will be testifying before the committee this morning. I'll also note that absent from this morning's discussion are broadcasters who represent small and minority-owned radio stations. Amador Bustos, the president and CEO of Bustos Media, owns many Spanish language stations throughout the United States. He offered to testify before the committee to provide that perspective this morning, but he was not given the opportunity. In lieu of his testimony, I would ask unanimous consent to enter his January 26 Radio Inc. op-ed into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Additionally, unlike other platforms, local broadcasters don't only play music, they also serve a public interest. They serve communities across the United States, local news, community relevant programming, critical life-saving emergency alerts, and are often a vital partner with local charities and public causes. When the power and internet stop working, radio continues to broadcast life-saving notices, and they have been especially helpful during the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. For example, WKRC in my congressional district back in Cincinnati partnered with the Hamilton County, Ohio Health Department to focus on COVID education and vaccine awareness. WIZF, also in my congressional district, has featured and promoted 3 minority-owned businesses each week that have been struggling during the pandemic, free of charge. And in the last year alone, one other station in my congressional district, WREW, has aired over 2,000 public service announcements and donated over 4,000 promotional spots to local organizations and raised over $800,000 for charitable causes. Radio stations throughout the country have contributed in similar ways to their respective communities. Finally, I'd like to note that in times of public emergencies like floods or hurricanes, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, relies on radio as well. Because of its reach and resiliency, radio services, they serve as the backbone of the nation's emergency alert system. FEMA has invested tens of millions of dollars in hardening radio backup facilities around the country, including WLW in Cincinnati, where FEMA constructed a hardened site from which station personnel could broadcast critical information to the public for months on end if necessary. Some, like former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate, are concerned that imposing royalty fees on radio stations could put public safety at risk by diverting resources from emergency alert capabilities. I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from former FEMA Administrator Mr. Fugate.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And finally, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter two letters into the record, one from the Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters and another letter signed by all 50 state broadcast associations noting their concerns with the legislation, like this particular legislation, the American Music Fairness Act. So I'd ask that. Thank you. So with that in mind, I look forward to this morning's discussion and testimony from our panel of witnesses. Thank you for holding the hearing, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Recognize the gentleman from Georgia, the chair of the Subcommittee on Courts, Intellectual Property and the Internet, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on this very important topic. We are in a much different world today than we were in 1972 when Congress first created a performance royalty. That was back when everyone listened to the radio and bought records based on the music they heard on their local station. This is far different than the variety of ways that people listen to music today. In this vibrant, complex ecosystem, it's clear now more than ever that we must work together to address the issue of radio broadcast performance rights. It goes without saying that artists should be compensated for their work, and as the COVID pandemic has made painfully clear, working class artists need steady royalty streams because they can't always rely on other ways of making money from their craft, such as through touring, whether due to pandemics or simply the fact of getting older. I commend the work of my colleagues, Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Issa, on crafting the American Music Fairness Act in a way that approaches this issue thoughtfully with different and much lower royalty rates for small and independent radio stations, while ensuring artists are compensated when their songs are played on the radio. But in addressing the issue of radio broadcast performance rights, we must also be sure that we are addressing the concerns of the broadcasters and all those involved in local radio. It is local radio which raises important health and social issues, support local journalism, and provide much needed information on emergency services during natural disasters. Obviously, all the different parties involved in this issue are differently situated with respect to being able to accommodate change. And I believe it is through hearings like we're having today that we can work together to resolve this longstanding issue and explore how to fairly compensate creators. I'm pleased that we are joined today by such accomplished artists and other industry professionals to help us further consider this important issue, and I look forward to their testimony. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the Courts and Intellectual Property Subcommittee, Mr. Issa, for his opening statement.
Chairman, I would like to note that today, the reason the ranking member is not here is the funeral of Bud Brown, who served in this body from 1965 to 1983. And hopefully we will remember him for two reasons: a fine legislator and a man who came in 1965 after Frank Sinatra had already asked for some sort of compensation. And at 94, when he passed away and now is being buried on Groundhog Day, yes, we are here again, and we do not have a solution. I say all of that not tongue in cheek, but because we have been here for over half a century arguing that Industries at that time paid nothing and made billions, now are gone to paying everywhere you can think of except this one loophole. My friends at the broadcast industry will always find a freshman and tell them, please do not support this tax. I would ask unanimous consent that the Americans for Tax Reforms and Citizens Against Government Support, against tax reform, which supports this bill, it ain't a tax. As a matter of fact, when we look at it, if it was a tax, then public broadcasting would not be paying for streaming because, of course, if it's a tax on terrestrial, it's a tax on streaming. So I'm here today to echo what the chairman said, because he said most of what needed to be said, but perhaps did not take this on in the way I'm going to today. After more than 20 years of being told that you can't afford a penny, I'm here today to say this bill is a hand to say effectively all we're asking for is a penny. There are about 5,000 stations in the United States that make less than 1.5 million. Whether they fell within the lower amount or the higher amount, they would pay no more than $500. That means that 5,000 plus stations would pay about $2 million total, a fraction of what they probably pay in NAB membership every year, and certainly a fraction of what they pay in income taxes. And most importantly, a fraction of what they pay in streaming for the exact same material going, as the chairman said, over the same speakers. So I'm looking forward to this, but on Groundhog Day, I would have to say, we've been here before. We've debunked the statements of why no money can be paid. And I hope that people on the broadcast side, after this hearing, will come together and simply ask the question, are you better off just and telling us that the only way you'll support this is if you get a reduction in what you're already paying in streaming? Or are we better off simply never giving fairness as your industry more and more is paying on the streaming side and not paying on the other side? Today, for NAB's 5,000 smallest stations, I would reach out and say, if you paid just $500, you could be locked into never having to pay anything more than that. Your entire cost of music for the vast majority of small and intermediate stations would be so small that you pay NAB more in dues than you would, in fact, pay to have the music that allows the world to enjoy a better life and allows you to make a living. So I would suggest that. I would say that Congressman Deutsch and I stand ready to find creative compromises, but zero continues to be a number that denies hundreds of millions of dollars to our performers around the world, and for no particular purpose, because we are talking a very small amount as streaming continues to grow. So, Mr. Chairman, I know I've gone on a little long, but I appreciate that you're holding this hearing and you're not giving up on something that the late Frank Sinatra and the not late, but getting up in years, Dionne Warwick, both championed. And I would ask that their statements, both historically and this past year, be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I will now introduce today's witnesses. Gloria Estefan is a multi-Grammy award-winning singer, a singer-songwriter, musician, and recording artist. Known as the Queen of Latin Pop, she has sold over 100 million albums worldwide and released 38 #1 hits across the Billboard charts. In 2015, she and her husband, Emilio, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their contributions to American music. And in 2017, she became the first Cuban American to be named a Kennedy Center honoree. Today, she continues to work with the Gloria Estefan Foundation on multiple causes, including education, health, and cultural development. Barry Mussarsky is a partner and the co-leader of the Music Economics and Valuation Services practice at Citron Cooperman Advisors, LLC. Previously, he served as a senior economist at ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. Through his work studying music copyright economics, Mr. Mussarsky has worked with a wide range of artists. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Boston University and an MBA from Cornell University. Lawrence Boo Mitchell is a Grammy Award-winning engineer, producer, and composer, and the owner of Royal Studios in Memphis, Tennessee. The son of the well-known music producer Willie Mitchell, Boo began his musical career at the age of 16, writing songs and playing keyboards for such artists as Al Green. Later, he worked as manager and talent coordinator at his family's club on Memphis' historic Beale Street, bringing in a range of iconic performers. As the owner of Royal Studios, he has been a producer and engineer working with a wide range of popular and award-winning artists. Curtis Legette is the president and chief operating officer of the National Association of Broadcasters. He previously served as executive vice president for government relations before being named to his current role in 2020. Prior to joining NAB, Mr. Legette served as senior counsel to Senate Judiciary Chairman Patrick Leahy. He received his BA from Providence College and his JD from Cornell University Law School. Dave Pomeroy is a bassist, writer, and producer, is the president of the National Musicians Association, and is an international executive officer of the American Federation of Musicians. As a studio musician, Mr. Pomeroy has played bass on more than 500 albums, including 6 Grammy-winning recordings with a diverse range of artists. He's also released more than a dozen projects on his label Earwave Records, and is a longtime columnist and advisory board member for Bass Player magazine. He has served as president of the National Musicians Association, AFM Local 257, since 2008, and has served on the International Executive Board of the American Federation of Musicians since 2010. We welcome our distinguished witnesses, and we thank them for participating today. I will begin by swearing you in. If you would please turn on your audio and make sure I can see your face and your raised right hand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
I affirm.
Let the record show the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timer on your screen. Ms. Estefan, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gloria Estefan. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, but I'm a singer, songwriter, musician, recording artist for over 46 years, an actress, businesswoman, and proud member of SAG-AFTRA. And although I would never toot my own horn, and for the benefit of those of you that may not have a clue as to who I am also an 8-time Grammy winner, a recipient of the Ellis Island Medal of Honor and the Ellis Island Family Heritage Award, the Gershwin Prize for Popular Song from the Library of Congress, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and in 2018 had the incredible honor of having one of my songs added to the National Recording Registry of the Library of Congress as one of only 500 titles out of nearly 3 million of the library's recorded sound collection that were of cultural, historic, and aesthetic importance to the American soundscape. And those are not my words, those are theirs. Thank you so much, Chairman Nadler, Congressman Shabbat, and all the members of the Judiciary Committee for allowing me to speak here today. Committee members, I want you to think of a song that's deeply meaningful to you. It doesn't have to be one of mine, although I secretly hope it is. Maybe it was the song that played during your first kiss, or the favorite tune of a late relative, or lyrics that helped you get through a difficult time in your life. Or maybe a song that was playing that time that someone dragged you onto the dance floor to do the conga at some wedding. Music speaks to the soul. It evokes emotion, it inspires. It brings us solace in challenging times. And as the late, great Dick Clark, who was a friend, so wisely said, it is the soundtrack to our lives. Music has value. And that's why I'm here today, to encourage you to vote in favor of the American Fairness Act. Each of the songs that are precious and meaningful to you was a labor of love for the songwriters, the artists, the musicians, and producers that brought it to life. They poured their own hearts and souls into its creation. But when their music is played on the radio, artists don't get paid. Only the songwriters do. The radio stations benefit from the advertising dollars, but the artists that breathe life into a song, the featured artists, the singers, producers, and studio musicians are left out. This can be particularly problematic for older artists whose songs are not in the top 40, but still get airplay. I would venture to guess that many of the songs that mean the most to you are ones from these music legends. And I, in fact, raised my children listening to the local oldies station as I drove them to and from school. At that time, the 50s, 60s, and 70s were considered oldies. Those things have changed now. My son and daughter loved not only hearing the beautiful and catchy songs, but we're also able to learn a deep appreciation for the varied styles of music that American artists have been creating through the years. While I'm the one testifying before you today, I represent hundreds of thousands of Americans who endeavor to make a living making music. Each of us has passion, talent, and drive. I was blessed to be able to make a full living doing what I love. And you know these artists. They're your family, your friends, and neighbors. They sacrifice so much to pursue their passion for music, often having to take on multiple jobs to pay the bills. The American Music Fairness Act is for them. For so many American music creators, life has become dire since the start of the pandemic. As a result of COVID, they have had to drastically cut back on live performances or cut them out altogether, eliminating an important and often sole source of revenue. These hardworking middle-class Americans cannot pay the rent with the exposure offered to them by broadcast companies. It simply doesn't make sense that artists are not being paid when their music is played on one specific platform, AM/FM radio. Why hasn't this been rectified sooner? Traditional AM/FM radio is the only platform that does not compensate performers for the sound recordings they use to fuel often billion-dollar businesses. This corporate radio loophole makes broadcast radio the only industry in America that can use another's intellectual property without permission or compensation. Every industrialized country except the United States provides a performance right. Moreover, when American-made music is played overseas, other countries collect royalties for American artists and producers, but never pay those royalties because we don't reciprocate. This inequity costs the American economy and artists more than $200 million a year, as was stated before. I want to take a moment to point out that although we are asking radio stations to pay their fair share, I'm a very big fan of radio and its place in music. As a child, it was the only place
The
that
witness's time has expired, so please sum up.
Okay. Well, I'm gratified that it's going to include protections for small and local broadcast stations that create important institutions in our communities. And what it will do is ensure that all competing music platforms are treated equally. Thank you for having me here today. Your dedication to all artists is so deeply appreciated. And I hope you will continue your efforts along with many champions across the Capitol, like longtime supporters, Senator Leahy and Blackburn, to move this bill forward to ultimate success. We're counting on you to make this right. And though life isn't fair and we can't change that, the payment of music royalties should be, because that's what respect is all about. And thank you for allowing me to represent my fellow artists.
Well, thank you. Mr. Mussarsky, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning to all. I've been asked to appear before this committee to render my expert opinion as to the status of performance rights sound recording exemption for terrestrial radio performances in the United States. First, I've spent my entire 40-year career as a music industry economist studying the relationship between music and commercial radio. First, I was the senior economist for ASCAP, which is a music rights organization for songwriters and publishers. I then became economist for one of its competitors in Nashville, called CSAC. Since 1992, I've been the consulting economist on this issue for the Recording Industry Association of America and continue with my work with Sound Exchange, actually since its origin. And then finally, I continue to provide consulting on this subject to major music publishers and have so since 2006. My analysis of radio has determined that it relies on an extraordinary amount of music as its core input to drive $7.6 billion of available music formatted revenue per year. That 79% of radio revenue is attributable to stations whose purpose is to provide music to its listening audience. In fact, based on that number of stations utilizing the music format as its chief programming input, I estimate that over 714 million non-licensed sound recordings are performed each year on commercial radio stations. In fact, music is so important that radio itself promotes their use of music to attract listenership and is the chief purpose for their slogans and taglines to attract audience attention. But most essential to this discussion and the nexus of radio station programming and record promotion value, which was the reason cause for the exemption to begin with, it is now shattered, as that association between radio and promotion is counterfactual to the new radio music economy. I study this every day, and I've done studies on what music provides to radio and what's the inventory that radio relies on to sell itself to its audience. When we looked at the actual airplay of what was playing on radio, only 36% across all formats of radio station spins can be classified as newly released and therefore sensitive to promotion claims. In actuality, 53% of all spins are considered gold. That's a determination by radio itself. And this is a concept that's been growing over time. This older music is already very well known to the music fan community, and in fact now represents the majority of record industry. And the recent trends show that new music is now well discovered on other platforms such as social media and digital services. But despite this pervasive need for music to drive its revenue, only a tiny fraction of radio's operating costs are allocated for the right to perform all this content. On a time-based measurement, 67% of a music formatted radio station is occupied by the playing of a sound recorder. 67%. Against that backdrop of usage, only 4% of stations' operating costs are relatable to this amazing input. I must conclude, absence of a right for using sound recordings on terrestrial radio is no longer rational on economic terms, given the radio station's use of music and its programming. I would end here by saying that there are only really two issues at hand, just two issues. One is the loophole that radio has been provided, which is the promotional claim, still valid? Answer, no. The second, will small stations suffer as a result of this impact of new costs? The legislation protects those stations. So the two most important driving considerations that you would have for this law, they're both well understood. So thank you very much for your time today. I'm happy to answer questions about my data, and I appreciate your time as well. Thank you.
The gentleman, we thank the gentleman. We thank the gentleman. Mr. Mitchell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Dear Chairman Nadler, Congressman Shabbat, and members of the committee, my name is Lawrence Boo Mitchell. I'm a Grammy Award-winning recording engineer, producer, composer, musician, and the co-owner of Historic Roll Studios here in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm also a member of the Board of Governors of the Memphis chapter of the Recording Academy. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to testify. In 2014, I was visited here at Roll Studios by songwriters and producers Mark Ronson and Jeff Basker. After visiting the studio, Mark told me that he wanted to record his album here, including a track with Bruno Mars. Over the next several weeks, some of the finest musical talents from Memphis and around the country teamed up to record the song Uptown Funk. It became the #1 song of the year and eventually the #1 song of the decade. In 2016, it won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year, the first record made in Memphis to win this honor. Uptown Funk was a huge radio hit. To this day, it's one of the 20 most played songs of all time on American radio, but no one involved in the recording of Uptown Funk has ever been paid by radio broadcasters who profited from their work. Because of a loophole in the copyright law, radio broadcasters are allowed to play records without asking for permission and without paying compensation. They can play records on the air for free and use our music to sell billions of dollars worth of advertising. I can't think of another industry in America where you're allowed to take someone else's property and use it without permission or compensation. Uptown Funk was also a huge radio hit around the world. The track reached #1 in Australia, Canada, Israel, New Zealand, and the UK. In every one of those countries, broadcasters pay royalties for radio play, but American musicians didn't get paid for Uptown Funk. Almost every other country in the world recognizes a performance right for records played on the radio, and they require broadcasters to pay royalties to artists and musicians. But foreign countries won't pay American artists and musicians until the US fixes the law and reciprocates. Every year, American artists are losing hundreds of millions of dollars in international royalties. Fortunately, there's a solution to fix this injustice: the American Music Fairness Act. It is a bipartisan bill introduced by Representatives Ted Deutsch and Darrell Issa. Under this bill, artists, performers, vocalists, producers, and other music makers involved in the creation of a sound recording would receive compensation for their music played on radio stations across the U.S. Importantly, the bill safeguards the royalties received by songwriters and publishers for radio play. It also contains key protections for small broadcasters to ensure that local and community radio stations continue to thrive. This week is the 50th anniversary of Reverend Al Green's legendary Let's Stay Together album, which was produced, recorded, and mixed here at Royal Studios by my father, the late Willie Mitchell. The title track was a #1 hit and has been added to the National Recording Registry at the Library of Congress. But my father, who passed away in 2010, tragically never received a penny from radio for his work. And shamefully, neither have the other great Memphis musicians and vocalists who created this work, like the High Rhythm Section, Rhodes, Chalmers, and Rhodes, the Memphis Horns and Strings, James Mitchell. This is a gross injustice and a stain on the legacy of our great nation. Some things have not changed from the time my dad started at Royal Studios till today. We still produce and record great music. Radio stations still pay no royalties to performers. Time is running out to fix this injustice for the artists of my dad's generations, like Reverend Al Green and Reverend Charles Hodges of High Rhythm. These artists aren't looking for free promotion to sell records or to go on tour. They simply want to be compensated for their work. The pandemic continues to disrupt touring, live, and recorded music. The lost royalties from radio could make the difference in whether a musician can focus on their career or has to take a second or third job to make ends meet. Royal Studios is the 4th oldest recording studio in the world, but my sister Anna Mitchell and I have struggled to maintain this place. If we had been able to collect my dad's royalties from radio over the past 50 years, our small business and our family would be in better shape today. Those who create music answer to a unique calling. It takes God-given talent and an extreme amount of hard work and dedication to your craft to be successful in this business. Today, I'm calling on Congress to help us keep the music playing. America has given the world popular music. It's time we honor our music creators the way other countries honor theirs. Please pass the American Fairness Act, because musicians should not be penalized for being Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Legette, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Nadler, Congressman Shabbat, and members and staff of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Curtis Legette, and I am proud to join these impressive panelists and testify today on behalf of the NAB's more than 5,200 free local, over-the-air radio stations that serve your communities every day. Broadcast radio recently celebrated its 100-year anniversary, and our 239 million weekly listeners demonstrate that our unique appeal remains as strong today as ever. The reason is simple. We are always on, we are local, and we are completely free to all listeners without expensive subscription or data charges. And in spite of decades of technological advancement, no other platform combines these qualities. This enduring value has never been more apparent than in the current pandemic, where local radio is fulfilling its mission of keeping listeners connected, safe, and entertained in the face of its own significant challenges. Mr. Chairman, 4 years ago, I sat with you and several of your judiciary colleagues, Democrat and Republican, in this committee's library. At that time, in the aftermath of our work together in support of the Music Modernization Act, you made a straightforward request of the broadcast and music industries, all of whom were represented in that room. You asked us to work together to develop a proposal on this terrestrial performance royalty issue that could represent a win-win for music creators and local broadcast listeners. In response, NAB worked for more than 18 months and offered numerous proposals to our industry partners behind closed doors that aimed to achieve that goal. Our approach was tethered in the belief that both artists and listeners could benefit from a change in law that didn't simply create a new burdensome royalty for broadcast stations, but instead enabled broadcasters to innovate, incentivized them to play more music, and benefited artists by compensating them for that increased airplay, whether it took place over the air or through a stream. When our concepts were rebuffed, we came back to the table with new ideas time and time again. Unfortunately, the music industry was unwilling to do its part in these negotiations. Our proposals were legitimate, made in good faith, and NAB was committed to seeing whether common ground might be possible. But beyond lip service, at no point were we even met with a formal counteroffer from the music industry. That was disappointing to me and other broadcasters at the time. And as a result, we find ourselves in this hearing room today debating a performance fee proposal that is strikingly similar to its predecessors, one whose introduction the music industry advocated in spite of knowing that it does not strike the balance that you and your colleagues requested of us during that meeting 4 years ago. Mr. Chairman, at a moment when local stations are doing their best work, when in the face of a global pandemic, we are connecting communities rather than dividing them, informing them rather than misleading them, and providing our critical service free to all listeners when many Americans are struggling financially, the American Music Fairness Act would impose a new royalty on local radio that is financially untenable for broadcasters of all sizes and unjustified as a matter of policy. Broadcasters thank Representatives Kathy Castor, Steve Womack, and the 234 House and Senate co-sponsors of the Local Radio Freedom Act, which recognizes our unique value and opposes any new performance fee on broadcast radio. I want to be clear. NAB remains committed to discussions that would further our partnership with the music industry and enhance our unique value to artists without diminishing our ability to serve your communities. And make no mistake, artists and their labels recognize this value in the real world, even if not in their Washington, D.C. advocacy, through countless award show acceptance speeches, social media posts, and direct station outreach seeking airplay. We are proud of that partnership, but the American Music Fairness Act would undermine it. Thank you for allowing me to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Legette. Mr. Pomeroy, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Congressman Shabbat, and members of the committee. I'm honored to speak to you today in support of the American Music Fairness Act. I'm a bassist, songwriter, and producer, and a longtime resident of Nashville, Tennessee, Music City. As president of the Nashville Musicians Association and an international officer of the AFM, I've been advocating on this issue for more than a decade. This long overdue legislation is critically important for backup musicians and vocalists, the unsung heroes of the music industry, and will end decades of unfair exploitation of their intellectual property. I fell in love with music at an early age, and I moved to Nashville at the age of 21 to follow my dream. I've played bass on hundreds of albums and dozens of hit singles with artists like Don Williams, Emmylou Harris, Elton John, Willie Nelson, and Trisha Yearwood, including her biggest hit, She's in Love with the Boy. Billboard magazine recently gave Trisha an award for that record being the most played song on radio by a female country artist over the past 30 years. Trisha has never been paid a penny for those millions of radio plays, and neither have I or any of the other musicians and singers who've made that song into a hit record. How is that fair? Backup musicians and singers play a critical role in the creation of the final product you hear on the radio. Every situation is unique. Orchestral recording musicians are under extreme pressure to perfectly execute a written part in 1 or 2 takes, and rock bands may camp out in a studio for months at a time looking for that one moment of magic. Some records are put together by 1 or 2 musicians, one part at a time, using constantly evolving recording technology. In many cases, like She's in Love with the Boy, musicians are presented with a song in a raw form and work with the producer and artist to create a collective musical arrangement on the spot. There are countless examples of an improvised musical figure or backup vocal part that adds that special something to a song that makes it a hit. That's what we do. After all the work that goes into making a hit record, when it is played on AM/FM radio, it generates revenue for the broadcasters, but they only pay the songwriter and the publisher. For perspective, the only other countries on the planet that do not pay artists, singers, and musicians for the use of their work on terrestrial radio are Iran and North Korea. Do we really want to be on that list? This is a balance of trade issue, or more correctly, an imbalance of trade issue. We create the vast majority of the world's music, but it's almost impossible for American musicians to get the money they are rightfully owed from overseas radio play. Every year, $200 to $300 million of our money is being held by foreign collectives who use the poor excuse that the US doesn't pay foreign musicians for their small share of our AM/FM airplay. The money we have earned is trapped overseas until Congress passes legislation that will unlock that ongoing taxable revenue stream for American musicians. This will make a huge difference in the lives of creators who are struggling to feed their families. Music is one of the United States' greatest exports, and its positive impact on our economy and the everyday lives of Americans is immeasurable. But what is measurable is the billions of dollars that US terrestrial radio makes on the backs of those who create the content that drives their advertising revenue. In just 3 months in the third quarter of 2021, 5 of the biggest broadcasters made $1.6 billion in revenue, an average increase of 20% from the previous year. Yet they claim they can't afford to pay anyone. The changes the bipartisan AMFA proposes should have been part of the Music Modernization Act of 2018. The broadcasters were the only major part of our industry to refuse to participate in this collective effort. Satellite and digital radio, TV, commercials, and film all pay musicians when their work is used to create revenue, and it is time for terrestrial radio to do the same. The AMFA will not put small stations out of business or hurt songwriters, as the NAB claims. The bill has several provisions to ensure that small, independent, and community radio stations will not be unduly burdened and will pay as little as $10 a year, and stations that make less than $1.5 million a year will only pay $500. We appreciate the services that local radio provides, but this will not put them out of business. Technology has changed the music industry in ways that are making it very difficult for musicians to earn a living wage. The pandemic has only made this worse. This is not about superstars and labels making a money grab. It's about helping working class American musicians who deserve respect, just as Aretha Franklin, Spooner Oldham, and all the musicians and singers who worked on that iconic record deserve. We urge you to pass the American Music Fairness Act. Thank you very much.
We thank all the witnesses for their testimony. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Estefan, I understand that it takes many artists to create the popular sound recordings we hear on the radio today. How does the lack of a public performance right affect the non-featured working class musicians and sound engineers who work on these songs? Do you think the failure to fully compensate music creators hurts musical innovation?
Absolutely. It makes it impossible to make a living out of it. I know that I've been very fortunate because I am a songwriter. So in instances, for example, like the song Conga, that was my idea, but written by my drummer. Anytime it was played on AM/FM radio, which was the only place it was played when it came out, because this was in 1985, he was compensated, and I'm glad for that because he's a person that's been able to make a living from writing the song. But neither Miami Sound Machine nor I made money in that respect. Fortunately, we've been able to tour in the best years that music had. There were, as long as you were selling records, actual physical copies, which no longer exist, there was an amount. We were paid 7.7 cents per song per side. And whether it be a vinyl record or a CD, you were selling a physical copy of that music. Now that is no longer the case. And thankfully, the Music Modernization Act helped that a bit by creating some streaming revenue, which still has a ways to go. But this loophole that has been around since performers were performing live on radio and were being paid at the moment that they perform live, but there were no recordings, that loophole has stood forever. And people like singers that don't write music haven't made a penny for their songs being played on this. So yes, it becomes difficult for them to be able to take that up as a career when you know that you're not going to be able to make a living at it.
Thank you. Mr. Pomeroy, you represent the 80,000 members of the American Federation of Musicians. Is the promotional value of airplay enough to compensate the musicians you represent? Why or why not?
Absolutely not. That is a trickle-down factor that is the promotional value for the main artist is becoming more and more negligible. But for the backing musicians, there's absolutely they get no discount at the grocery store. And, exposure is not a form of commerce. And musicians are having to take other jobs. If it weren't for the other residual funds that are paying musicians as they should, we would see even more people walking away from this industry that is one of America's greatest exports. So yes, this has put not only our members, but musicians from one end of the country to the other under extreme pressure to figure out a way to feed their family. It's getting more and more difficult.
Thank you. Mr. Mussarsky, you are an expert in the economics of the music marketplace. Based on your research and expertise, could broadcasters afford to compensate musicians for the performance of the intellectual property on AM/FM radio?
The quick answer is absolutely yes, for two reasons. One, we really should be talking about the right here, not the rate. So the establishment of the right is important because the only reason it doesn't exist is because of this no longer relevant consideration of promotion on commercial radio. When we talk about the rate, that is perhaps subject for another discussion, but this legislation takes care of the small broadcaster and only allows for a fee of $500 for the majority of stations to play millions and millions of songs. So it is very lightly treating on the small station side. It does leverage the value of the license fee on the large station side. Remember, as I've said to you, 2/3 of the time, 2/3 of an operating hour, you're hearing the sound of a sound recording. You're not hearing anything like that. So this is their major reason why they can collect up to $8 billion in revenue. And it should be something that should be taken care of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to again thank the witnesses for their testimony here today. Mr. Legette, let me begin with you. In addition to being a senior member of this committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, I served for 6 years as the lead Republican, part of that time chair, part of that time the ranking member, depending on which party was in the majority, um, chairing and leading the House Small Business Committee. And small businesses, I think most people realize, really are the backbone of the American economy. About half of the people who work in America work for a small business. About 70% of the new jobs created in the economy are created by small businesses. And local radio stations, for the most part, are by definition small businesses. And I've already indicated in my opening statement some of the various services that they provide. So let me ask you this. Some proponents of the AMFA argue that small local radio stations really won't be burdened all that much by imposing on them a small royalty fee. With that in mind, could you provide some insight into the impact that you believe this legislation would have on those small radio broadcasters?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. Let me start by saying that I think the impact of this legislation on our industry is being somewhat misrepresented by its advocates. You know, there's a lot of focus on one or two very large station groups, but there are close to 200 radio groups across the country who would fall outside of any of the exemptions in this legislation, more than 4,000 stations. So those are stations that every member of this committee knows in their local communities that you view as small businesses. They will be touched by the core of this legislation. But your specific question in terms of the truly small broadcasters, those with 2 or 3 employees who would fall within the exemptions in this legislation, and we very much appreciate the bill author's attention to them. $500 is a significant fee for those station owners. That is the difference for a small business, as you know, Congressman, between camp for your children during the summer, between a family vacation. This is real money. It's real money that they are already paying when they are simulcasting their stations over a stream. And this would add real economic impact on top of that. So it's very, very significant and meaningful for those stations. And it's why small stations have come out and raised concerns with this legislation, as well as some of the larger groups.
Okay, thank you. If this legislation were passed, how would it affect the public, the average person, in your view?
What local radio is doing in communities is so unique, especially in today's media ecosystem. The hyper local focus, the fact that we are free. Now, there is a large demographic, as you are all aware, that simply can't afford all of these new subscription services. Local radio is there for them. It is a lifeline. The last 2 years have only underscored it. Right? When you need local information, what's going on with your schools, what's going on with local businesses, where can you get a COVID test? Communities are turning to those local stations, and higher costs would undermine that reinvestment in that local service. I also think it would have a dramatic impact on music airplay. And so the value that the creative community does see in radio, you're going to see less music airplay. I don't think that's good for anyone at this table.
Okay, and then finally, before I run out of time, relative to our nation's emergency response infrastructure, I mentioned in my opening statement about the importance of broadcast radio to agencies like FEMA, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's my understanding that in case of disaster, radio stations are equipped to broadcast critical messages to the public for months on end if necessary. Would you describe how the nation's public warning system could be impacted if new royalty fees were imposed on local community radio stations?
Thank you for the question. Local radio stations are the backbone of the emergency alert system. So as the financial model for local stations, large and small across the country, breaks down, that is going to jeopardize those stations' ability to service that backbone. But I would say the impact in times of emergency goes much broader than that. Broadcasters are core in those emergency communications, not just because of the EAS system, but because of our architecture. We have a resilient redundant system that ensures that when cell services go out, you're dealing with a wildfire, you're dealing with a hurricane, cell towers are down, local radio stays on the air. And it is also a hyper local focused message, one that you're not getting through any local medium. So as you undermine the economics behind that, the investment that those stations can make both in that architecture as well as that localism, you're undermining those public safety benefits.
Thank you. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses. This is really an important hearing, and I've learned a lot from each of the witnesses. Ms. Estefan, I appreciate your explaining the origin of this loophole. I never knew that it really began when radios were recording live performances. And here we are today, long ago. Very interesting. I'd like to ask a question, Mr. Mussarsky. In terms of, I do think it's important, and the legislation recognizes that when you really have a small locally owned radio station, we want to make sure we're nurturing that. And I think everybody agrees. So my question is, what factors went into the calculation of what is that small business? And, I come from the state of California where salary schedules, everything is different than in other parts of the country. Was that factored in terms of revenue and the like to define what is that small business?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. The factors that went into determining a small station was simply looking at the concentration of revenue that is organized and controlled by the top tier of this industry. And this legislation wanted to protect the smaller broadcaster who might have a harder time making this cost transition. But please keep in mind something. We're talking about a loophole that only existed in Congress because of the notion.
I'm not arguing that, but I'm just saying, we have a rough time in some parts of this industry. And I'm thinking specifically about a very tiny radio station in California that is completely locally owned, but because they're in California, they have to raise more money because the staff salaries are very different than you might find in Tennessee or in Mississippi. So I'm just hoping that we've incorporated that varying price structure as we take a look at the definition of what's small.
Congressman, those stations are protected under this legislation.
Let me ask, Mr. Pomeroy, your testimony was important and fascinating. One thing caught my attention in particular, and I'm hoping you can explain how it works. You said that because of our current legal system here, that the revenues that are generated abroad for our artists are stranded there. Can you explain how that works?
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate you asking. In 2012, we went to Beijing for the World Intellectual Property Conference and helped pass a treaty with 131 countries that contained the phrase, no collection without distribution, establishing that principle. All around the country, especially all around the world, especially in Europe, collectives are getting the money as they are allowed to do under their rules, where AM, FM, terrestrial radio does pay royalties, but they're holding our royalties on the pretense that we don't pay Bulgarian and Czechoslovakian musicians for their work. And it's completely an imbalance of trade. We make the vast majority of the world's music, and they're holding our money that they've made using our music because we don't pay them for the much smaller amount of foreign music played over here. It would open up a floodgate of new taxable income for musicians so they can feed their families and see whether or not they might be able to afford to send their kids to summer camp. Because right now we've got musicians who can't feed their families and they're not worried about summer camp right now.
Well, I appreciate that. That's really outrageous. I mean, I didn't know about that until this hearing today. And I think it's very important that we fix that, because that's just so terribly unfair to the artists in America. And you're right. America is the origin of most of the creative music in the world. I'll just mention, I think Ms. Estefan referenced this, but I listen to oldies. I'm an old fogey. And, the idea that this is promotional value for those oldies. I mean, people aren't going out and buying those old recordings. We're thinking back. We already have them. We're thinking back, and especially the artists of yore that may not have been able to get the kind of revenues that are available now. How unfair to them. So I'm hoping that we can make progress on this. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I really appreciate the hearing, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gomer. Mr. Gomer. All right, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, there's so much in so little time. I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, I thought that Ms. Lofgren did a very good job of describing our generation. Ms. Estefan, your husband and I were born the same year, so he too, perhaps the time in which the idea that a young artist needs to be recognized, as to a lesser extent are you. But, this is the 60th year of Mike Love and the Beach Boys touring, 60 years, and yet to get paid for any time AM or FM play with him. Normally when you do this, you call on your witnesses. In this case, I would like to call on our NAB witness, Mr. Legette, for a moment. You said something that I really have to challenge. You said that somehow $500 was going to put a station making $1 million of gross revenue a year out of business because they could pay for their kids' summer camp. Is that your statement on the record under oath?
Thank you for the question.
Just please a yes or no. Was that your statement?
No, that was not my statement.
Well, I heard the pay for summer camp and $500, as though $500 was going to be a problem. I want to say something to you on the record. I was talking to Sam and Joyce Moore. They have a foundation that has offered to pay for any station that asks for relief, the $500 under this bill for those companies making less than 1.5 million. So let's set that aside for a moment. I just want to get two things out that were in your statement that I think are good to have on the record. One, you talked about negotiating in good faith and it was rejected. That negotiation basically was to reduce the revenue of streaming as part of a deal. Isn't that always been part of the NAB's position? They want to pay less in something that the Copyright Board has already established, which is their streaming royalties. Is that correct?
No, our goal has been to grow the pie overall and send more streaming.
Wait a second. Has that, look, I have very limited time. Has that been part of your negotiations? Have you ever had a deal where you said, no, we're fine paying that, and now we'd like to talk about an incremental amount that we would pay elsewhere? Or has it always included bringing up the fees paid under the streaming? Just yes or no.
It has always involved a holistic approach, yes.
Okay, so when we're discussing it today, I just hope everyone understands that the reason that was a non-starter is that is the revenue that Emilio and Gloria are currently getting, okay? And they're getting it because of revenue, and I'll just give you an example. $800,000 was paid by public broadcasting for their streaming. Okay, it's real money and it's growing. So let's understand that for some reason, and this is the Committee of Antitrust, for some reason, you can afford in these startups, these divisions of your companies, including iHeart, you can afford to find a way to pay the streaming. And I'm using public broadcasting because it's a figure I could easily get, but all of your companies are paying growing revenues for it. You can afford to do it, but somebody's child isn't going to be able to go to summer camp if we charge even $500. So that I just want to make sure we have that out. Mr. Mitchell, I will one more thing, and I think you're the expert in this case. Can you tell me the difference between a digital broadcast, AM or FM, and streaming when it comes out of a typical speaker with the kind of recording quality that you know exists and comes through various speakers? Is there any real difference? Or are we dealing today in the digital world with identical sound, simply two different ways it's being delivered?
It's identical sound in two different delivery methods. The same Al Green coming off of Spotify sounds the same as Al Green coming
and lastly, an economics question very quickly, Barry. Is there any reason that we would not, in an arm's length negotiation, fairly give some benefit and reduction in royalties for any and all of the things that Mr. Shabbat had named that broadcasters do that might in fact affect the offset of what the fair royalty should be? Is there any reason that would?
The gentleman's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
A proper rate proceeding would take all factors into account, and the broadcasters could claim that value, and it would be considered by those that were involved with the rate setting mechanism.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thank you so very much. Just a ride down memory lane. I remember being part of these battles in the introduction of this legislation in 2009, and they were battles, and the scars are there. But I think we came out with recognizing the importance of what we're doing here today, and I want to maintain by citing the numbers that we are also very concerned about how radios of all levels, AM and FM, because they are important vehicles and vessels in our community. And likewise, the humanity of our artists are very important. And if I might put into the record, my work with Dionne Warwick, Sam and Joyce Moore, and so many others during that era, we were wrapped together with each other because, as I said, the scars were deep and the work was hard. And I think we came to some valid compromise. Today, let me specifically cite your great work, Ms. Estefan, and ask you the question. In your testimony, you referred to older artists who are not in the top 40 but still have airplay. Help us understand how this impacts those artists differently than those within the top 40. And my time is short and I want to get other questions. Thank you so much for being here and your leadership and your talent and how much you've given to America. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's lovely of you to say. And by the way, I'm also one of those older artists. So I can't exclude myself from that. The thing is this, when you put your life and work into music that is entertaining everyone else, you would at least want to be able to pass on to your children this work that you've done, especially if it's still being enjoyed. Like Frank Sinatra, for example. He has entire channels devoted to him on internet radio, which he is going to get paid for, but he still gets paid on, he still gets played on many, many stations that harken back, that are AM, FM, that harken back to the time. So as an artist, he will not receive, or his heirs, any of that music. And I think it's important, the legacy that an artist leaves behind, especially when it's something that has lasted for decades and continues to be enjoyed by people everywhere. They may be gone even physically from the earth, but their children, their grandchildren certainly deserve to benefit from the music and art they put into the world.
Thank you so very much. Sam, I'm sorry, Barrett, Mr. Mussarsky, how often is it that sound recordings are in play for which no compensation is provided? And you might also comment on the poverty that many of our artists, I'm reminded of Jackie Wilson, who preceded, if you will, many artists, and was destined to a not so happy ending in his life. Would you answer that, please?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Just in a big picture, radio is pumping out about 12 songs per hour, okay, constantly. It represents 2/3 of their program day is the playing of a sound recording. And what's unfortunate for those that are just artists and not writers is there's no compensation vehicle for all that airplay that takes place on AM/FM radio. And I just want to also say briefly that this is not only unique to the United States, but there have been well-formed license fees and rates that have been agreed to by other jurisdictions in Canada, the United Kingdom, and France, and Germany, that does take into account these artists that really rely on that type of revenue. And guess what? The stations accommodate that. They're able to afford it. And there's compensation, and there's still growth in those radio markets as well.
Thank you. Let me just put into the record, the commercial and public stations that make less than 100,000 a year will pay $10. Public stations that make between 100,000 and 1.5 million a year will pay $100, and commercial stations that make 100,000 to 1.5 million years per year, only 500. I just want to put into the record that there are dying stations that are African American in particular and other ethnic stations. In this legislation, we must find that balance. I will advocate for them because they are instruments of information, they are family in our communities. I think we can make this happen and work for those beautiful artists who are American treasures and preserve radio, in particular Black radio and Hispanic radio, that are treasures as well in our community. I want to be part of that. I know this bill is going through committee, but I want my members to know that this is something very important that I think we can do together and respond to our artists, which I totally agree with. With that, I yield back at this time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for the delay. I thought somebody was ahead of me in the order. I was just jotting some notes down here, collecting my thoughts, because I like most of us, am benefiting from the discussion here and all the discussions we have on this important issue. We've got to find a solution and the right balance, but there are competing interests here. There are fundamental principles juxtaposed to one another. I'm a conservative. I believe in the inherent value of the fundamental property right, which is a foundational premise of our country. And we want the market to be fair to artists to produce it. At the same time, I'm genuinely concerned about the survival of terrestrial radio and the vital importance that local broadcasters play in our communities. And so it's not an easy one. I don't think it's easy for many of us, but we're struggling. And I got my start in some. I was a constitutional law attorney and all that, but I was a talk radio host as well. I was a local broadcaster, so I know a talk show host, and so I know the struggles they have. I know the very tight margins that they work under. I've been in those studios. I spent a lot of time in those places, and so I see their argument here. So what's been covered, I think, is one of the vital points and one of the real values I think that local broadcasters have in our communities. I come from Northwest Louisiana. I mean, we are natural disaster prone. We deal with hurricanes and tornadoes and all sorts of things. And our local broadcasters are an essential component of emergency preparedness. And the idea, the thought that they may not be there one day is of great concern to me and to many others. So I really appreciate my colleague, what Mr. Shabbat said, bringing up the importance of radio in emergencies and some of the comments that have been made. Let me just ask Mr. Legette, can you elaborate a little bit more on how passage of the American Music Fairness Act might affect emergency radio broadcasting?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question, as well as for your comments and recognition on the value of our local stations in your district and across the country. This legislation, which deals with one aspect of stations' relationship with the creative community and would result in substantial fees across our industry, will have a direct effect of leading to less reinvestment in the service that we're providing to communities. And so in times of emergency, hurricanes, wildfires, that just simply means less boots on the ground, less investment in our infrastructure, the emergency alerting system that was alluded to earlier. That takes real time and resources, work with the FCC. All of these are costs. It's less dollars to drive into that. And I think that has a real bottom line impact on the communities that all of you serve. Let me also say that the advocacy and the way that this issue is being characterized, I think, is somewhat misleading in the following way. The broadcast industry has grown up for 100 years around a legal framework where we are paying when we play music over the air. As Mrs. Stefan said earlier, when our music is played over the air, we are paying hundreds of millions of dollars in fees to ASCAP, BMI, these performing rights organizations. Those PROs distribute those dollars to songwriters. The songwriters have publishers. The publishers partner with labels. This is a business relationship that has enabled decades of growth in the broadcast industry and growth in the music industry and produce industries that are the envy of the world. So to just look at one fee on one aspect of this without looking at how the dollars trickle across all this, I'm absolutely committed to ensuring that artists have more dollars in their pocket. If the current system's not working to do that, let's work on that instead of just imposing a fee that's going to undermine those emergency services that you're asking about, Congressman.
I appreciate that. I only have a couple seconds left. Let me just say that for those of you that don't live in a tornado area, hurricane or whatever, there are many, many times in my life when I've been huddled in a hallway with my family as a child, and then now as a parent with my 4 kids and my wife, and the power's out. We're in areas with they don't have rural broadband that's reliable. The only thing you have, the only connection you have in a weather emergency like that is the voice on that radio. And we all have battery powered radios for emergencies in Louisiana. It's an essential part of our life. So I'll close with that, yield back. I appreciate everybody's time.
Gentleman yields back, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your holding this hearing and all of your work for music and fairness in this area, and all the witnesses who have testified here today. The American Music Fairness Act would restore balance to the music industry, ensure artists are properly compensated for their labor, and I'm proud to co-sponsor it. I'm a friend of Mr. Legette's. I look forward to him coming to Memphis and touring the rural studios, getting an appreciation of some of the grit and grind that goes into those records. It's not an easy thing, and a lot of the people that perform there didn't make a lot of money when they were recording. I mean, they got older. A lot of the older performers had to go back on tour, and that wasn't easy for them either. Boo, it's great to have you here. I'm proud to have a Memphian with me and my friend Boo Mitchell. Boo, you're on my hall here in Congress. There's a picture of you and me and Thomas Boggs and Amy LaVere from Memphis Magazine. So you're on the wall out there, along with BB and Albert and Isaac. So we've got our Memphis music collection out front. You and your father, William Mitchell, did so much for music, for artists in the industry. High Records and World Studios. If it weren't for y'all, we wouldn't have love and happiness. And the world goes around with love and happiness. And President Obama wouldn't have been able to sing "Let's Stay Together." You need to get him in the studio to do a cover of "Let's Stay Together." I think y'all would have a big hit, and I think Curtis would play it, and it would all be wonderful. Your family spent generations in music and contributed to a host of acclaimed projects in different capacities. Could you talk about the role of producers and engineers in the creative process?
The gentleman will suspend. Someone is not muted. We're hearing music, but someone is not music. So please mute. Mr. Cohen, go ahead.
I don't know how that happened. Al Green just appears magically. Boo, would you tell us about what producers and engineers contribute to the process?
Yes, it's a very tedious process. Producers have to have the vision, and producers, a part of that vision is choosing the musicians to play the song. In my father's instance, he chose the high rhythm section, Charles Hodges, Leroy Hodges, Archie Turner, Howard Grimes, Al Jackson Jr. Howard is the drummer on Love and Happiness and half of Al Green's hit records. And he lays in a hospital bed here in Memphis, Tennessee, still living in the same zip code because he simply can't afford to tour. He can't afford to perform music, but his music is being performed all over the country via FM and AM radio.
Well, not so much AM. AM's kind of gone the way of talk radio. DA and LOK, but they don't do a whole lot of music these days. The public performance licenses and sound recordings are already used for internet and satellite performances to terrestrial broadcasts would help to fairly compensate all artists involved in musical work. What would that additional revenue stream mean for you and other artists at Royal Studios?
That additional revenue stream would mean the world to me and all of the backing artists. This isn't just about, the featured performing artists. It's about the people the backbone of the people that make the music, the session musicians that you've never heard of. Like, I don't get promotion when they play Uptown Funk. They don't mention Boo Mitchell. So it's it's not just about the featured artists. It's about the the blue collar people that go into making these great records. And if I was a British citizen, I would be compensated. If I was Canadian, I would be compensated. But since I'm American, I'm not compensated, and that's just not right to me.
Let me ask this question. Mr. Pomeroy may have anticipated the question. He has his hand up. I don't know. But whoever can answer it. How did it come to be that songwriters got paid when their songs were on radio and performers didn't? I mean, songwriters, they're tremendous, Harold Arlen and all that. But without Sinatra or Elvis or, it wouldn't be the same thing. Why was it that songwriters got it and performers didn't?
I mean, without going into all of the historical details, I think essentially the artists, musicians, and singers did not have the leverage to insert themselves in that equation. So they got left out and they were never put back in. Everywhere else around the world, we get paid, except for the United States, where the music comes from. And so, these royalties will have a huge effect on our ability to continue to be the leader in the world's music, as opposed to having a whole bunch of part-time musicians who have to work down at the car wash in order to make a record like Car Wash.
Well, thank you, everybody. My time is up. I just want to say to Ms. Estefan, I don't believe you've been performing for 46 years. You look like you were born 46 years ago.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah,
Gentlemen, his time has expired. Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the hearing. Appreciate all the witnesses being here today. It's been very informative. Mr. Legette, streaming services, satellite radio stations around the world all pay performance royalties to artists. And I'm just curious, how are they able to make it work without suffering the severe negative consequences that you've described for on-air radio broadcast?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. None of those services do what we do, which is that we are hyper local, which requires real boots on the ground resources, and we are completely free. Our competitors are charging subscription services. Local broadcast is not based on that model. So I think there are fundamentally different businesses at play here. The role that we play in communities across the country as a result of that local responsibility and the fact that we are, as an audience, serving those who can't afford those other services makes us unique, but the economics are just very, very different.
Let me ask you this question too. You said that you had participated in negotiations for 18 months and you'd offered real concrete proposals. I'm curious, what, if any, was the royalty proposal? Because I wasn't part of that. I don't know anything about that. What, if any, was the royalty proposal for performers offered by NAB?
So our conversations were more centered around frameworks, and frankly, to the extent we did discuss numbers, it was done under an NDA in order to have a free exchange of ideas. But our concept as an industry has been that if you incent broadcasters to invest and innovate by taking care of what we feel like is a very burdensome structure for streaming simulcasts of local stations, and you attach to that some compensation for airplay, that will result in more airplay overall, higher royalties overall. And there are a lot of different ways.
Would that have included royalties for performers?
Yes.
Okay. I would be interested in seeing what that looks like, if you can get out of your NDA so you can share it with members of Congress so we can look at that.
I'd
Thank
be
you
very
so
happy
much.
to have that conversation.
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell, appreciate you being here. Uptown Funk was, even I liked Uptown Funk. That was a good song and got a lot of play. So here's my question for you is, did the playing of Uptown Funk on broadcast radio help lift Uptown Funk and make it even more commercially viable and successful?
Yes.
So, and I think back, I know a number of people who live in Nashville that are artists, and they would love to get something on, broadcast radio, because they think it would actually facilitate sales of their song, streams, and get them more notoriety, which is what they want to do, and they feel that that's necessary to succeed. Is there some kind of synergism between broadcast radio and the artist who's performing that particular piece of music? I guess I'll ask Ms. Estefan. Can I ask you that question?
Absolutely, radio has been instrumental in the past decades in promoting a song. It led to more sales, but right now there are no sales. There's rarely vinyl records are made, and for collectors mainly. CD sales are practically non-existent because there's a whole new streaming and internet way that music is getting put out. So what was there before to benefit from the promotion on broadcast radio is no longer there. That is gone. So whereas before getting played on radio might get you, the ability to sell more records, right now it really doesn't help in that respect. And maybe it would help if you're touring, but now nobody can tour. So it's really changed very much.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I want to introduce into the record a piece by Ted Gioia, who's a music writer from The Atlantic from a week ago. It's called His Old Music Killing New Music. If I can introduce that in the record and then just read a quote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. He says, every week I hear from hundreds of publicists, record labels, band managers, and other professionals who want to hype the newest new thing. Their livelihoods depend on it. The entire business model of the music industry is built on promoting new songs. And then he goes on to give the analysis that 95% of streams on Spotify and other streaming services are music that is considered old music. We're talking everything beyond 18 months old. It's really a very dynamic, when Ms. Estefan points out the dynamic of the streaming services vis-a-vis broadcast radio, it is really a change that's happened over the last 10 years. I am curious to see where we're going to go with this, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to hearing from Mr. Legette to show me what he had proposed, because I'm interested in seeing how this turns out. Thank you. Time's expired.
The gentleman yields back to Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Legette, in your written testimony, you state that this bill would upend established business relationships under the copyright laws. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Thank you for the question. The broadcast industry for 100 years has grown up and built businesses around this music licensing regime. And what is unique about what's being proposed here is, in other areas of copyright, all areas of copyright, as new technologies emerge, whether it's the piano rolls, the VHS, the CD player, streaming, Congress has updated copyright laws to account for those new technologies and ensure the right incentives are in place for creators and for users. A change in law here would disrupt a legacy industry and its relationship with the music industry that is intertwined across all actors here. It starts with the direct royalties to ASCAP and BMI, the performing rights organizations. Those organizations, their songwriters, relationships with the labels and artists, but also the value that we are providing and promoting, not just what would have been 20 years ago, a conversation around album sales and live performances, but now on-demand streams. And there is extensive data on the way that broadcast radio play drives on-demand streaming, especially for the legacy artists that have been mentioned here. So this is all very much intertwined. You go and disrupt that with just an additional fee on one player in this ecosystem. And I understand the needs of the creative community who want to see more sources of revenue. But we need to look at this a little bit more holistically than just jumping straight from the creator to the user, because there are a number of different actors siphoning off dollars from this.
Well, how do you suggest that the performers be compensated for their work that is played on broadcast radio?
So from a broadcast radio perspective, I believe the best way that we can provide value to artists, not just today, but going forward, is through a music licensing system that's incentivizing us to innovate, to ensure that our value, it continues to be provided through streams for listeners wherever they want.
How can that be accomplished?
So I think it can be accomplished through a more holistic discussion around these laws. We are open to having that, would eagerly have it. And as I stated in my testimony earlier, we would like the other side to come to the table and have this more holistic conversation. And we're being rebuffed by the music industry, who wants to look at this as a very, very narrow, singular issue that misrepresents it.
Well, let me ask you this. The Section 4 of the act that we are discussing today provides that broadcast stations that generated less than $100,000 in revenues in the preceding calendar year, the yearly fee would be $10. That's not asking a whole lot. For public broadcast stations that generated between 100,000 to 1.5 million in the preceding calendar year, the yearly fee would be $100. And for all other broadcast stations that generated between 100,000 to 1.5 million in the preceding calendar year, the yearly fee is $500. Can you explain how that $500 is so oppressive?
Well, for a truly small business, which are the very small radio stations, 1-2 employee stations that would fall into those exemptions, $500 is real money. And it's not just $500 in a vacuum, it's $500 piled on top of fees that they're already paying to ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, to Sound Exchange when they're simulcasting, to the FCC for their licenses. And again, they can't offset that by suddenly charging a subscription. These are free services. But the bigger focus here is on the 4,000 radio stations, the 180 or so station groups that in your local communities, I think you would characterize those as small and mid-sized stations who fall outside of those exemptions. And these royalties can total hundreds of thousands of dollars if we assume they're going to follow a template of a per play stream, the way the CRB has set in the webcasting context. So we're very concerned about this.
Okay, let me stop you there. Mr. Mussarsky, some argue that small broadcasters like the ones just described by Mr. Legette cannot afford to compensate musicians for the performance of their sound recordings. In your opinion, does the American Music Fairness Act adequately account for that concern?
The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Those particular stations, Congressman, are well protected by the legislation.
Thank you. Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To me, this is a simple issue of property rights. Somebody owns a right to a composition or a production, and that right can only be traded with the consent of the owner. For example, if I compose a song, that song belongs to me. I might choose to sell it to a recording studio or license it to individual performers or keep it for myself. Nobody has the right to use that composition without my consent. And that composition can be traded in any number of ways. Let's say I sell it or license it to a recording studio. The recording studio then hires musicians and a performer. They record their work for compensation. Now they've produced a recording that they own. So whether a broadcast helps to promote a recording to me is irrelevant. What matters is whether the broadcaster, the user of the rights, and the owner of the rights agree to the terms. It may be the studio would want to pay to promote it, or at least allow the broadcaster to broadcast it for free in order to promote it. But that's up to the owner of the rights and the user of the rights. In any event, the recording should only be used according to the conditions and compensation that have been agreed to by both sides. Whether it's done by a direct license or more likely bundling collections of recordings under terms agreeable to the owners of the rights. In any event, one party owns the property, which can only be used under the terms that it's agreed to. To me, the government has a responsibility to protect the property rights of its citizens, including intellectual property. That's what copyright protection is all about. It needs to be applied and enforced according to these simple principles of voluntary agreements between the owner of the right and the user of the right. So, Mr. Legette, if I recorded a talk show from a broadcaster and then played it on my radio station without compensation, would that broadcaster object?
Yes.
Well, isn't that what's happening with respect to music recording? Somebody goes to the expense of creating and producing a hit song, and then somebody else broadcasts it without their permission.
Well, Congressman, I agree that if we were starting this conversation whole cloth from the outset, you would have a very different music licensing regime than you have today. This is an issue of property rights, but for broadcasters who have been publicly performing music for 100 years, they have been paying the right that was established in the 1919 Copyright Act, which is the copyright that's held by the songwriter.
But to me, that is not serving the purpose of government, which is to protect the property rights of its citizens. Just because we've been doing it for 100 years doesn't necessarily make it right. I'm reminded of the story Lincoln told growing up on the Sagamore River, where they hauled eels out of the river and skinned them alive right there on the dock. And Lincoln told them he thought that was a terribly cruel thing for them to be doing. And one of the eel skinners says, "Now, son, just calm down. It's all right. We've been skinning eels this way for years, and they're used to it." Mr. Mussarsky, this bill seems to be a half measure. It provides some compensation, but not at a rate agreeable to both the owner and the user. For example, a hit song by a well-known artist is likely to be worth more than a new song by an unknown artist. That unknown artist might be very much want to have their song broadcast on radio without compensation. The owner of the hit might want to be paid for its broadcast. Why shouldn't these arrangements be worked out between the owner and the seller?
Well, they can be, Congressman. And in fact, we have a mechanism, the Copyright Royalty Board, that can take in all these factors into consideration. And I remind you that they've figured out these considerations around the globe. Now, there are jurisdictions in every country that the governing body has looked at the promotion value of one side, the size and scale and affordability in the other, and they've all arranged and very successfully. And it's a companion right. It's not the right. It's the right of the sound recording, the artist and the sound recording owner. And they, in every other country, have lived comfortably side by side with the rights of the music publisher and the songwriter. And all the questions that you've raised, and so well you have raised them, have all been fairly explained and judicially determined by these other sovereignties.
So as a practical matter, these rights can be protected and can be enforced. It's simply that we choose not to. And my concern is that we're assigning an arbitrary license fee without the consent of the owners of these products. Why can't we just do it the right way and protect the rights of the owners of all of these productions?
The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Your mic is muted, Mr. Mussarsky.
Congressman, you are absolutely right, and we should be doing just that.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Deitch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thanks to all the witnesses. Especially, I want to thank Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Pomeroy and Mrs. Stefan for the insight that you've provided into
Have we
Did
lost
we lose him,
audio?
or is that on my end?
I think we lost Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Chairman, you're on mute if you're speaking.
Yeah, we've lost Mr. Deutsch, so we'll come back to him, Ms. Bass. Oh, Mr. Cicilline, rather.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and really thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. And this hearing has been very useful in really understanding these issues. And on the one hand, of course, it's vitally important that we protect artists' rights to be adequately compensated for the work that they produce. As so many have said, music plays such an important role in our lives. It comforts us in times of pain, allows us to express joy in times of celebration, and often occurs during some of the most memorable moments of our lives. And so musicians and songwriters deserve to be paid fairly for providing us with this. It's also to underscore the importance of local broadcasters, who are not only a primary source of trustworthy news and entertainment, but also irreplaceable during public health and safety situations and weather situations, particularly because of the emergencies. And also, broadcasters are facing really an existential threat to their survival. And I think, interestingly, both the broadcasters' challenge and the artists' challenge really are a result of the harmful behavior of giant companies. For the broadcasters, it's the tech monopolies. For the artists, it's the studios. So I think there's a larger problem here about the power of artists to negotiate, the power of broadcasters to be treated fairly by the big tech companies. But, you know, I think we do, I think we all recognize the value of local broadcasting and what it means and how essential it is for the providing of trustworthy, reliable sources of information and news, which is why I hope very soon we will mark up the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, with that will be real relief for local broadcasters. So I think that, you know, this is a real challenge. I guess I'll start with Mr. Legette, who's my friend too, because I hear what you're saying, and you are absolutely right. I am a champion for local broadcasters. What seems unfair to me is that while what you're doing is really important as a local broadcaster, and we as a community should be responsible for making sure you survive because of all the value of your public services and your announcements, it does seem to me a little bit unfair to shift the burden for that to artists, to musicians. Like, musicians shouldn't be responsible for funding or subsidizing all the great work that you do. And so my first question is, does the provision, and why am I not wrong in kind of thinking about it that way? And also, do the provisions about the small broadcasters cover most of the broadcasters? I have no sense of what group falls within that $500 range of local broadcasters. Is that 80%, 20%? Like, what's the kind of magnitude of the problem?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question and your comments about the value of local broadcasting. Let me take this in two parts. First of all, to be very clear, there is a pot of money that it is economically tenable for local broadcasters to pay in royalties to rights holders. We are not hell-bent on preventing artists, performers, for having a larger slice of that pie. But this is a larger ecosystem that, you know, has grown over decades with one set of relationships that for broadcasters has started with the PROs, has filtered its way through the system. But we are all for a holistic conversation. If that money needs to be divvied up differently, let's have that larger conversation. There's a reason that songwriters are complaining about how they're compensated by streaming services. They're not complaining about broadcasters. These dollars are distributed very, very differently depending on which platform is publicly performing the songs. And our concern is just picking out this singular issue of a terrestrial performance royalty and suggesting that it's economically feasible to pile that on top of a system that's already been in existence and that businesses have been built on both sides, broadcasters and music industry, for decades. To your question about the small radio exemptions, first off, we very much appreciate the bill authors for recognizing the value of small radio, but those exemptions leave out a huge swath of the industry. You know, hearing the music industry advocate on this, you would think that this was an issue about one or two groups. There are 177 radio groups that own stations that would fall outside of these exemptions. And so this is not just about a couple of large radio groups. This is about the vast majority, close to half of broadcast stations across the country, more than 4,000, that would be impacted outside of these exemptions.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Tiffany.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say to the artists and the producers that are on this, that were presenters today, thank you for your contribution to the Great American Songbook. We have had so much wonderful music that has been produced in America over the decades, and just thank you so much for doing that. And I was a beneficiary of that with a business that I own called Wilderness Cruises in northern Wisconsin. I had artists that came on our excursion boat regularly and produced music. Sorry, they did not use Miss Estefan's music, but I sure wish they would have. It was terrific, though, and I want to thank you so much for the work that you have done. Mr. Legette, back to the whole issue of private property rights, someone who has been a strong advocate of that my entire legislative career. How do I navigate that? That we're not protecting people's private property rights by these artists being compensated by your radio stations?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And let me just say, that's something that we have to navigate constantly at NAB in the larger sense as well, which is that I represent within my membership substantial content owners, content users. I think what makes this issue very, very unique is that you are delving into a set of property rights that was established 100 years ago, has certainly been modified over time, but which the local broadcast business and frankly the music industry has grown up around. And at this point, 100 years later, the AMFA would pull the rug out from under that and impose a wholly new cost. So I appreciate, to the degree that this is about core intellectual property rights, let's have a holistic conversation about how we get more dollars in the pocket of the sound recording creators, the artists, but there has to be a balanced way to do it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Pomeroy, you alluded to I went through all of your written testimony, and you alluded to the financial harm that was done as a result of the shutdowns and things that have happened over the last couple of years. It seems like that has been significant for some. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. You know, here in Nashville, which has the highest per capita musician population of any city in the world, we have seen many people who just couldn't stay and had to go back home. We've seen a huge drop in our workforce. Oh. And you know, it's a trickle down effect that we're not receiving anything. And you know, I heard a remark earlier about you know, asking for a larger slice for artists, musicians, and singers. We don't have a slice larger. And so I really appreciate this chance, but musicians are under such hardship because of the live music problems, the touring problems. This is a crisis like we've never seen. And if we want to undermine the ability of one of our greatest working groups that create exports that make this country the leader in the entertainment industry, if we don't do something, infrastructure is going to fall apart, and we'll be listening to music from overseas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Pomeroy. And I would just say that I am concerned about whether you call it a fee, a tax, whatever you want to call it. It does concern me, even for small stations. Is that the camel with its nose under the tent? As someone who's always been a limited government, small government legislator, it concerns me that we start that, and then where does it lead eventually? Because once a tax fee, whatever you want to call it, once it starts, it does concern me in regards to that. I want to make one final point in regards to this hearing today. I am very disappointed that this committee has went to virtual hearings once again. This is so unfortunate. We get so much better communication when we are live, when we are there in person, when there's that give and take that is going on. And once again, this committee, like some others, has gone to virtual hearings, and that does not get us there. And what I saw in the testimony that was written here today is this undertow of how shutting down our world over the last 2 years has had enormous consequences. And we're just beginning to figure out what it is. It is time for us to get reopened. It is time for this committee to go back to meeting in person. It is time to reopen the United States of America, because the collateral harm is incredible. And you just heard about it from Mr. Pomeroy. Let's reopen America now. And we should lead in the Congress of the United States of America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to try this again.
Yes.
This is a piece of legislation we introduced because it is time that we respect music. It is time that we honor the creators of music, and it's time that we treat them fairly. The fact that something has happened for decades that is wrong and unfair doesn't mean that this is what we should live with. That's why this legislation is so important. Mr. Legette, of course, we recognize how important local broadcasting is. I want to remind everyone, again, that our bill exempts radio stations with revenues under $100,000 and allows them to pay $10 a year for all of the music in the world. 80% of radio stations would pay $500 or less to play all the music they want. Mr. Legette, I think that $500 is even less than the membership fee to belong to the National Association of Broadcasters. So I want to go back. I want to touch on something you said multiple times, which is that the thing we need to remember is that radio is free. I want to explore what that means. Is it a public service? How is it? Is there money involved? How does the business work? When do advertisers get involved, and how much was the total amount paid in advertising to broadcasters over the past year?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Advertisers are obviously the cornerstone of our business. And I should point out, to this theme about how COVID has impacted all of this, and I have extreme sympathy for the way it has impacted the music industry. But for broadcasters who rely on local retailers, local car dealers, local restaurants for their advertising, it's had a dramatic impact. So we are a 100% ad-supported business.
Can you, Mr. Legette, do you know what the total amount was that was paid in ads last year in advertising?
I can get those dollars.
I would appreciate that, and here's why. There's this constant focus on small radio, and what you said is you represented that there will be less investment made in the emergency alert system. You said there will be there'll be fewer boots on the ground, that there won't be innovation. And I just want to make sure I understand, are you representing to the Judiciary Committee that companies like iHeartMedia, which earned close to $3 billion, is going to stop making those investments if this bill passes? That Cumulus, which earned over $800 million, is going to stop investing in their business and in their community. Is that what you're representing?
No, I'm not representing that it will stop. I'm representing that this will have a real impact on that investment, and that investment will be less.
So you said it would have a dramatic impact on music airplay. Are you representing that these companies that play the music, that draws people in, that draws the advertisers in because they know there will be listeners, and they know there'll be listeners because people want to listen to the music. When you talk about a dramatic impact, are you saying that they're going to stop paying? They're going to stop playing music? Is that what you're representing?
I'm not representing that they're going to stop playing music.
Okay, so then let me just ask. I'm sorry. Let me just ask one other.
They will.
Let me ask one other thing, because I don't have a lot of time. You talked earlier. You said that you acknowledged. I don't, in passing, that $500 is significant when they're already paying for streaming. They're paying for streaming to artists, right? That's what you were referring to, when they pay artists when the songs are streamed on their stations online. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Right. And isn't there some, is it hard to understand why so many of us would be so offended at this notion that musicians should be paid in one context, but it's perfectly fair for them not to be paid here at all? I'll finish with this. You referred a couple of times earlier to the burdensome royalties. Is it burdensome when you pay DJs to play music, Mr. Legette?
It is a cost of doing business.
Is it burdensome? Is it a burden? Is it a burden on the industry? Is
No,
it a burden on the? Is it a burden on the industry to pay talk radio hosts who draw in listeners because they want to hear that? I'm going to answer that for you. Of course it isn't. Only the musicians who produce the music that make your radio stations be able to sell advertisers, only those creators, those musicians are not being paid. It is time for fairness in American music. That's why this legislation is so urgently needed. And I yield back.
Gentlemen, the gentleman yields back, Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on a line of questions that Mr. McClintock had. This hearing is in the context of a bill, legislation, and I've got a question about the legislation, and maybe somebody could help me answer it. Section 5 establishes that if a copyright holder directly contracts with broadcast stations to license terrestrial performance rights, the broadcast station must still pay 50% of the direct license payment to the entity administering the royalty. If this were to become law, is it still the case that if performers wanted their material played for free on the radio in order to promote, for instance, their local appearances, which honestly, for the small performers that I know, their appearances produce more revenue than the streaming revenue that they're seeing. Would it still be the case that it could be a completely royalty-free production, and that nothing would additionally would have to be paid over the status quo? Mr. Legette, can you answer that? Is the licensing compulsory, even if the artists don't want it?
So thank you for the question. The licensing is compulsory. So for the vast majority of stations across the country, they're paying a fee regardless of what airplay they would be putting over their airwaves. That having been said, it is extremely cumbersome when you're talking about thousands of broadcast stations, thousands of right holders. But to the bill, I believe, intends to allow a local station group to go and directly negotiate a deal with a rights holder that could potentially fall outside of that regime.
Okay.
It's hard to say how that would work in practice. I think it would be extremely impractical and burdensome, but I don't want to misrepresent what I think the bill intends.
Right. Okay. So we don't have to litigate all of that now. I just want to make sure that we're not, if it truly is the right of the artist, then the artist needs to still have the right to give that away if they find that the promotion is in their interest more so than some small royalty that they might receive. So I just want to make sure that that's not overlooked. Ms. Estefan, I enjoyed your music. I was in high school in the 80s and 90s, and it was very popular. You mentioned that the artists should and their heirs should enjoy royalties for a long period of time. right now the term of copyright protection generally begins at the time of creation and lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years. Do you think that's appropriate length of time?
Well, whether I think it's appropriate or not, at least it's a protection for the next 70 years after I die for my kids and heirs. That's a separate conversation to have, but there is some protection, and they will be getting those royalties from the songwriting that I did, but they will not receive any royalties from me as a performer. For example, when Conga or Get on Your Feet that I didn't write, but I performed, when those get on radio, they won't receive anything from that.
Then let me ask you a question. If somebody invented an insulin pump that saved lives and he was an inventor, how long should that inventor enjoy royalties, and should his heirs be entitled to those royalties as well?
Wow, you're giving me a lot of power here.
Yes.
Whatever I say goes. I'll tell you what, Benjamin Franklin gave all of his inventions for free because he thought that they were for the common good. And that's a wonderful thing. I did music because I felt it in my soul. I sing since I talk. And I probably would have done it for free, although I needed a day job.
Yeah,
but copyright law, you have judges and you have laws that establish, reasons and lengths of time.
Thank you very much. Let me summarize. Yes, I know inventors who would sell their blood plasma to keep inventing, but they can't make a living doing that.
No, absolutely not.
And I just want to make sure we don't have a double standard here where we're trying to give, patents only last 20 years. And people make inventors out to be evil people because they're trying to make a living. And
no,
here
absolutely.
we are. Yeah, and here we are with royalties for songs, which, I mean, they're enjoyable, but they don't save lives, but they last the life of the author plus 70 years. So I want to make sure that we don't call the inventors trolls, but we call them the backup artists,
Exactly. And a nice analogy also for these broadcast places, they pay both their anchors and the writers. In essence, what's happening, it would be as if they were paying the writers of the broadcast, but not the anchors for doing the job of anchoring the news.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you, Ms. Estefan.
Ms. Bass.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this meeting. Mr. Legette, wanted to congratulate you again for becoming the CEO of NAB, and it's nice to see you again. I wanted to ask a question about overall royalty fees that broadcasters pay, and I wanted to know if you could discuss how broadcasters, including small minority broadcasters, are navigating the economic challenges such as fees being brought.
Thank you for the question. It's extremely challenging. And broadcasters are paying, as an industry, hundreds of millions of dollars in fees to performing rights organizations, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC. On top of that, you now have an emergence of these new performing rights organizations that are taking slices away from ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. But it doesn't seem to be a zero-sum game for broadcasters and other users. So that's GMR, for example. When broadcasters are webcasting, they are paying royalties to Sound Exchange on top of that, and we pay our FCC license fees on top of the various vendors for our technology services. So suffice it to say, for a small broadcaster who just want to know that they've got the permission to play the music that they want to put out to their audiences, this has become extremely, extremely cumbersome.
So one other question, how is small defined? Is it by the number of stations that an individual or a company would own, or is it by their value?
Within this legislation, or how would I define it?
Yes, how would you define it?
So I would define small in the context of broadcasting as by level of community focus. And, I think too often we mistake scale as undermining small, because your experience with your local broadcasters, and I think your colleagues' experience as well, is that they operate very independently in local markets. And if they're doing their jobs well, they are invested in that community. And they are small businesses within that community. Now, scale is helping them compete with the Googles and Facebooks of the world for advertising dollars.
Okay, let me move on before my time runs out. Ms. Estefan, I know that you're coming to this position, you're coming to this issue from a different position. And I wanted to know if you could speak how the lack of a public performance right impacts the music marketplace and the overall economy. I heard your testimony before, you talked about the individuals.
Right. Well, let's start with the fact that foreign royalties, which the American government would be taxing if the American songwriters would receive it, is something that is being left on the plate right there. And also taxes that those performers would be paying based on royalties that they would be receiving is also left on the table. Look, I'm a songwriter and a singer. I'm fortunate that I'm a songwriter, and I'm happy that I've been able to reap those benefits. But there shouldn't be a difference for someone like a Dionne Warwick that may not have written her biggest hits because Hal David wrote them. She created those songs. She's the one that created the magic that people listen to and continue to listen to, because these songs we still hear. I don't think it's fair that whoever wrote the song be getting compensated, but the woman that made the magic for that song doesn't get a penny. That's the only thing we're trying to establish here. And there is a lot of money being left on the table. Tax dollars are being left on the table that we could be using also to fund all kinds of things. And there are a lot of things written in that will protect the smaller radio stations. Believe me, radio, I love radio. We would be nowhere without radio, particularly me in that era.
In my last few seconds, Mr. Mitchell, if you could respond. In my district, I have an awful lot of artists who are concerned about this as well. Mr. Mitchell, could you respond how it impacts the individuals?
Yes, it impacts us very greatly. I mean, we're talking about COVID now, but before COVID, we experienced the housing market crash in 2007 and 8. And with the advent of MP3s, record sales were cut in half or more. And having a performance royalty would just offset all of that. This is a small business. Gloria Estefan, she's a small business. So you're talking about small businesses. That's what we are. The music creators, we're small businesses, and we're struggling to make ends meet because we don't have access to this money.
Thank you.
The time of the time is the gentlelady has expired. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy. Well, in that case, Mr. Bentz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses. Extraordinarily interesting. I wish I knew more about this space, but I'm going to address just a couple of simple questions to Mr. Legette. My understanding, limited though it may be, is that radio is a means of competition against streaming. And as I understand it, the radio business model selling advertising to pay for playing music or providing entertainment is paid for on a per play standard. And the streaming methodology, of course, is based on subscriptions. Radio is based on the amount of play with no regard to income. And this is a problem because the risk of the business is squarely on the radio station. I guess the question is, as these smaller stations, particularly many in my district out in Oregon, find themselves more and more challenged by all of the different multitude of platforms. I guess my question to you is, does radio, even as challenged as its circumstance may be, providing a competitive edge of some sort to drive down the cost of streaming to those who are the artists that are negotiating for streaming's use? Or am I misunderstanding it completely?
Well, I think where radio can stand out and where it will still remain very, very viable in today's media landscape is with a hyper focus on local and a service to a demographic that simply can't afford those subscription fees through other services. And a piece of that is our relationship with the music industry, the value that we're providing to the music industry. That value is extending to that listenership that I think remains very, very unique. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question on point, but I believe that there's a really unique value and niche that we fill that none of our other competitors are hitting. And I believe that the music industry benefits from that.
Right. Well, I'm sure that your answer is difficult because my question was poor. Let me put it a little more clearly. That does radio provide competition for streaming? And if so, does that drive down the cost of streaming to the artist?
So yes, I mean, radio is competing for listenership with other audio streaming services, no doubt about it. But I also think when you're talking about on-demand streaming, the Spotify's, the Apple Music's of the world, radio play is driving more downloads. It's driving more on-demand streaming. So artists are benefiting from that. That's the new form of what would have 20 years been, album purchases. So I think this is very much, we're competing on one hand, but I think what radio does is very different than what an Apple Music or a Google Play is doing in terms of that's the product that we're helping to promote.
Perhaps I said it backwards. In fact, I'm sure I did. What I should have said is, does the competition drive up the value to the artist? That was really the proper way to put the question. But so I think you've answered it despite my challenge in presenting the issue to you. Mr. Chair, a super interesting conversation for many reasons to me, but with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this very important hearing. I thank all the witnesses, certainly thank my good friend, Congressman Deutsch, for his leadership. Mr. Mitchell, as you testified, you worked on the song Uptown Funk. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that is one of the 20 most played songs of all time in terms of mainstream top 40 radio. Would that be a correct observation?
Yes, sir.
And so I appreciate your presence here today because this is an issue that hadn't fully thought through. The performer is incredibly important, and Ms. Estefan's presence here today, is an honor for all of us. But as a producer and an engineer, that's an additional dynamic that is pretty interesting to me. And your work on that song, I guess as I understand it, when it gets played on the radio, doesn't inure to you in the context of receiving any compensation. Is that right?
That's correct.
And is that fundamentally sort of one of the glitches in the system that you think could be life-changing for producers and for engineers?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because the simple fact that money is being collected around the world on behalf of Americans, but we can't receive it because there's no reciprocity. That money would be a huge impact to me and my family, this historic studio, and the rest of the musicians that aren't touring. They aren't, you're not hearing their names mentioned. They're struggling every day to make a living, but yet their music is being consumed.
Appreciate your presence here today and your testimony. And I think clearly this is an issue that we have to work through in terms of the music landscape, being changed, but also balance the interests of our broadcasters, particularly those, that do serve a niche, that do reach audiences that may not otherwise be reached, that do have specialty areas that are, smaller broadcasters. And I appreciate that dynamic as well that Mr. Legette has spoken to. But I am hopeful because many of us were involved in the effort to pass the Music Modernization Act. And that was complicated, that was difficult, that was challenging. And we addressed it because the landscape had changed over time, because we realized that, the way that people receive music had changed. It went from phonographs to vinyl, vinyl to 8-tracks. That didn't seem to last for a long time. 8-tracks to cassettes, cassettes to CDs, CDs to download, download to streaming. Takes a while for Congress to catch up. We finally did. And we work with everyone, musicians, creators, artists, internet platforms, and the broadcasters. And I'm thankful that the broadcasters were supportive of that effort. And I'm just hopeful that similarly, we can find a way to come together to address the changes in the landscape that have clearly occurred that are impacting the creative community, who the Constitution says to us we should support. That's why this committee, Judiciary, not Energy and Commerce, has the ability and the jurisdiction over copyright and content and creativity, because this was in our constitutional fabric and DNA. And I'm just hopeful with Ted's leadership and confident that as we came together with the passage of the Music Modernization Act in 2018 and did it in a bipartisan way, Democrats, Republicans, the left, the right, progressives, conservatives, all the industry stakeholders, that we can find a way forward here to accommodate all of these important issues. So thank you all for your testimony and for your presence, and look forward to working together on this issue. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Did you call on me, Mr. Chairman? Just making sure.
Sorry. I did call on you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our panel today. My home district has historically been fertile ground for some of the most influential music in America. It served as a rich foundation for jazz artists in the 1940s, and it allowed new sounds like grunge and alternative rock to emerge in the 80s and 90s. Seattle is and remains a bedrock of music, its influence cemented through local and national radio airplay. During the COVID-19 pandemic, artists that rely on live performance for income are suffering significant economic hardship. And meanwhile, huge conglomerate radio stations continue to rake in millions of dollars in cash by playing their music. Artists attempting to earn money earned from radio's direct competitors, online streaming services, receive minuscule profits. Last year, a local Seattle artist named Gabriel Teodros had over 80,000 streams for one of his songs, but he only earned about $90 from it. Mr. Mitchell, given this knowledge, can you talk about why it's especially important for artists to receive terrestrial performance rights?
I think it's important, and also to note, people, when we make music, it is a performance. It's just like buying a concert ticket. It should be treated no different. It's a public performance captured on medium, and every time you rebroadcast it, you're rebroadcasting a performance. So it'd be like not paying for a concert ticket. You don't go to concerts for free, and you're watching a performance. Our music is a performance, and we should be compensated for it. And the impact that it would have, not just to large artists, but to the backing musicians, to the session musicians, to the producers, the background singers, the people that do this for a living, they would be impacted greatly. This is a business that you have to have the heart to do it, and most people successful, they work hard for years to get where they are, and it should be compensated. Music is a national treasure. It's our #1 gift to the world. No country has influenced popular music the way that America has. There would be no British invasion, no Beatles. They were all listening to American music over the radio, and they all recognize their performers and their musicians. And it's time that America does the same.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. And as the mom of a musician, I also resonate very much with what you're saying. The Seattle-Tacoma area is the 12th largest metro market for radio in the country, boasting over 30 stations. These stations of all sizes, many of them public, private, or independently owned, play a huge role in popularizing up-and-coming artists, and they also have vastly different revenue streams. Mr. Pomeroy, can you elaborate on the contrast in revenue between big media conglomerate stations and smaller stations?
Well, certainly, we're talking apples and oranges, big conglomerates that are raking in billions, and then small stations. And no one wants to disrespect the services that local radio provides especially during times of crisis. No one wants to see AM, FM radio go away. But in terms of, what the value of what we do represents, when someone else makes money from what you do and doesn't share, it's just simply not fair. And so, it's an inequity that has shifted, but the fundamental aspect of it has not. And we're not asking for anything outrageous here. We're just asking for help keeping our industry alive from people who have been making money from our industry without paying us for decades.
Thank you. And in Seattle, we just had the news that our very well-known radio station Como and 2 other local stations were recently acquired by Lotus Communications Corp., a privately owned broadcasting company that rakes in about $24 million per year. Mr. Pomeroy, how would the American Music Fairness Act support smaller radio stations? For instance, the impact on their fees versus the fees of these larger conglomerate-owned stations?
The gentlelady's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Thank you,
Okay,
Mr.
thank
Chairman.
you. I'm sorry. Well, I just have to say that the impact of this law would change things drastically, because there are things built in to make sure that the small stations are not unduly burdened. And as long as they can, and even there are accommodations there for stations that are owned by conglomerates. There's a sliding scale that has been carefully thought out to make sure that there's a big difference between a small rural community station that is the lifeline in an emergency to iHeartRadio or any huge conglomerate that owns thousands of little tiny pieces that they make money from. So it's truly apples and oranges.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing. This whole thing is such a ripoff. It boggles the mind. One person I spoke to in the radio industry said, well, music should be free. And I said, groceries should be free, rent should be free. But as long as these musicians have to pay to live, how can we just rip off their music like this? Ms. Estefan, Sound Exchange estimated that the failure of terrestrial broadcast radio to pay royalties for sound recordings costs artists and rights owners around $200 million a year in performance royalties. What would that $200 million a year mean to artists, both well-known established artists and new artists just starting out? How would you translate that?
Well, obviously it depends on how many times your song is played, because this is all going to go into a kitty. For example, from the question before, if this bill was enacted, or there would be a copyright royalty board that would decide what is fair for the stations that make the bazillion dollars. It protects anyone making under 100,000 to $10, and between 100,000 and 1.5 would pay $500, I believe. So they're protected. For the artist, it would boil down to how many times your song is played. But those 200 million are just in monies outside of the United States. For example, in France, they take the monies collected from American songs that are being played, and they are using it to fund a French cultural organization, because they're not giving it to the artists that created this music. So in the meantime, those 200 million, which are just from outside, an estimate from outside the country, are being used by these countries for whatever they would like to use it for, because we don't have reciprocal laws that protect their artists. It's just like the minuscule amount that we get from streaming is divided depending on how many times your song is played compared to other artists. But at least it's something. Before it was nothing. So the Music Modernization Act really came through and established at least minimal amount of money for artists to receive. I think an example was Coldplay had a song that had 6 billion streams and they made $6,000 from it. 6 billion streams. This is the really the amount of money. So between COVID locking everybody down and those artists that have established, performances, that's gone too. So this has been going on forever, and we feel it's only fair that
Thank you.
the performers get their.
Mr. Mussarsky, so I guess I had that 200 million figure wrong. That was just from overseas, according to Ms. Estefan. What is the figure in America? How much money would eventually get to the artists if we correct this gaping loophole?
Thank you, Congressman. It would depend, honestly, about what the rate courts or the Copyright Royalty Board would decide that rate to be. I mean, I don't know that at this moment. I can tell you that the only reason we're even here today is because there was a consideration that radio was a promotional vehicle for the sales of recorded music. We now know that that's not the case anymore. Good data shows us that radio is relying much more on older music, not the stuff of promotion. So we know that the right should be reinstated. You're asking a question about how much would the pot be? And I would suggest to you that we have all these benchmarks around the world about what the share of revenue is, less the cost, less the allowance to small stations. And all of that data will come forth before the Copyright Royalty Board. I'm not here to tell you what that rate should be. I'd like to prepare for that. But I do think you need to institute the right first so that the rate can be considered finally. Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Mitchell, let me ask you about artists and people in the music industry themselves. Do they experience this as an injustice, an indignity, and exploitation of their work? And I know it's hard to organize artists because artists tend to be free thinkers and everybody's doing their own thing. But is there reason to think that artists and musicians are weighing in on this in order to get the public's attention?
Yes, it is very, it became apparent to some of my artists when we worked with musicians from overseas, and the overseas musicians are like, yeah, we get paid for radio play. And all of my legacy musicians, like the High Rhythm Section and others, they're shocked and amazed because these people have played on, 27 gold and platinum records in a row, and they can't afford to move out of their zip codes or can't afford to feed their families, and they have knowledge that this money is being collected for other musicians of other national origin, and it's it's striking and it's unfair, and people we want to be paid for our property the way everybody else is.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think you're muted, Mr. Nadler.
The gentleman yields back, Ms. Dennings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses here today. Mr. Legette, as we all know, the American Music Fairness Act includes a carve out for small broadcasters not owned by a larger conglomerate. And I know the time has been well spent today, but we want to make sure that we are doing our jobs as members of Congress as it pertains to this critical issue. I just love for you to talk more about, do you believe these provisions adequately protect smaller broadcasters? And if not, why not?
Thank you for the question. I don't believe that the provisions adequately protect small broadcasters in two ways. The first is there are more than 4,000 stations across the country who fall outside of those exemptions. And I know there's a fixation on the music industry's advocacy by pointing to one or two large broadcast companies. I'd also point out that even the largest broadcasters are dwarfed in size by the three major record labels. But the reality here is I'm advocating for nearly 200 radio groups across the country who would fall outside of those exemptions, who have stations in all of your districts that you would never characterize as large conglomerates. So the bill is incredibly far-reaching. even with the carve outs. Now, within the carve outs, you are truly talking about small broadcasters, 1 or 2 employee stations, where even a $500 fee is substantial. I'm not representing that a $500 fee is putting anyone out of business. If my previous testimony was taken that way, it should not have been, but it is real money that diverts resources from localism. So I believe this bill would truly undermine local service of the broadcast industry.
You also indicate that the legislation would jeopardize jobs, require radio stations to cut back their involvement in local communities, and place more pressure on radio stations already struggling to survive. I mean, that's a pretty stark condemnation of the bill and its possible effects. Can you be more specific about the possible effects to jobs and communities you believe will occur if this legislation becomes law?
Absolutely. So we have real concerns about the Copyright Royalty Board and what a proceeding that sets rates under this bill would look like. And our concerns are well founded because we have lived in that world for the last 20 years, setting rates for our simulcast streaming. Those rates have proven so burdensome that they have really hindered broadcasters' ability to innovate. So as we look at this, and it's of course hard to know what would happen if this were implemented into law, but if passed as prologue, you are talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in new royalty fees for local broadcasters that are already facing significant economic challenges, especially in this current environment where local advertising dollars from restaurants, retailers, car dealerships has been reduced as a result of COVID. There's just a lot of economic pressures. We've got real concerns about it.
Thank you. Mr. Mussarsky, how do you believe the carve-outs or the provisions in the carve-out protect smaller broadcasters?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It completely protects the small stations. It gives them coverage over an excessive fee. But we also have to remember something, okay? The top 20 broadcasters represent the lion's share of this revenue. They are large and they are using an enormous consumption of music. And in fact, 80% of the $9 billion a year commercial radio industry is dedicated to playing 2/3 of their time sound recordings. We're talking about an enormous amount of use for no payment whatsoever to the deserving artists and to the record company owner. So the only thing on the table that I understand as an economist is still valid. And that goes into the question of whether there is promotional value that's compensating the artist instead of the value of the license itself. And we have great data to show you that radio is no longer the promotional vehicle it once was. It caters to an older demographic with enjoying much more established music, not the kind that we promote. And therefore, if you're going to commercialize your music for your $9 billion a year revenue, it's time to pay for that cost.
Again, I'm out of time. Thank you to all of you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay. The gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to everybody, all the witnesses for hanging in there. I know it's kind of a long morning here. I just had kind of a question unrelated to kind of the discussion back and forth about the royalties, but mainly the mechanics or the logistics of it. Mrs. Estefan, I'll ask you first, how reliable is it when you're talking about some of the foreign-owned the royalties? Is the mechanics of that work, and do you actually, are the royalties paid timely, and what's been your experience with that part of the business?
You mean the royalties that they are holding that they aren't paying out to performance artists? Because I know that, for example, I am a member of BMI. They are a collection agency. They collect my written and the music that I write.
Right, because you're a composer, right?
I'm a composer, right. So on the composing side, I receive that, but they know because it's being held. There are cue sheets like there are for AM/FM radio that spell out exactly what's being played, when it's being played. So we know the amount of play going on over there and the rates. That's where they come up with those fees, but they're not being paid as of now because we don't have a reciprocal way in the United States to pay for their artists. So they just hold the money.
But it's reliable on the composer side, and the revenues are transferred on a regular basis. And so
As a
there's not
composer, yes. I mean, you always have the right, and we do sometimes because we have our own publishing company, and we
Yeah.
often audit because, like any business, you have to be on top of it and make sure that things are going. But there's a lot of little places where money is held outside the country, but then you have to put out the money to audit. It's a balancing act. But the American organizations that do collect for authors have been very good in my experience for the last 40 some years. For me, I can't speak for anyone else.
right. I think because there's kind of this idea floating around out there, and it might be out there just to kind of undermine any type of effort that, oh, this isn't kind of a reliable payment system, or the logistics or the mechanics of it doesn't always work. And maybe Mr. Mitchell, do you have any comment in that regard?
Yes, I have a letter here from Mr. Peter Leatham, who is the president and CEO of PPL. That is in England. It's Phonographic Performance Limited. They're one of the largest collectors of terrestrial radio rights for the United Kingdom. He says, the making of payments and matching of recordings used to a database to identify the copyright owner and the performance on a recording is a very manageable piece of work. This is already conducted by Sound Exchange in the US for various digital services and shows the work can be done. Also, he says, given the popularity of US recordings around the world, this would result in a net inflow of money to the US music industry and economy.
Okay, there you go. I mean, that's kind of what I was looking for. And it sounds like there's confidence that, you know, it could mimic, if the changes were made, to work kind of the way it does now with composition. So very good. That's all I had, Mr. Chairman. I would yield back.
If I could just.
The gentleman yields, Mr. Correa.
No, okay. I guess I
Mr. Correa.
Mr. Chair, I didn't know Mr. Pomeroy sounded like he had a comment to make.
Yes, if I could,
Sure.
thank you. I appreciate that. I just want to say that, yes, the overseas collectives are very professional, and they're frankly, to some degree, in disbelief that we're not playing by the same set of rules as they are. And that is going to be a huge game changer to bring in this money from overseas, help these people feed their families, pay their taxes, put the money back into the U.S. economy. But the money is definitely there and will continue. And if we start paying them what we owe them, we're going to get many times that amount in return.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Garcia.
Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Carrera is back on
Is he?
the screen.
Mr.
If you
Correa.
want to Call him
Thank you, Ms.
first.
Garcia. Can you hear me okay, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, we can.
First of all, I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today. I agree with a lot of the presenters today, my colleagues, that copyright production is so important to not only for this industry, but for this country. That's what we're known for. We're known for being creative. And so, you know, I'm clearly disappointed that such an important piece of legislation cannot be negotiated. We want to make sure that our broadcasters stay in business, but at the same time, I want to make sure that when my kids start writing songs and having proprietary, things out there, that they're paid for it. I'm going to ask folks, Mr. Pomeroy and Curtis, why can't we just sit down and come up with a win-win situation here? There's got to be a solution here that we can work on.
Thank you for the question. And you might have heard this in some of my previous responses. I am supremely frustrated here. The NAB has proactively offered time and time again, and worked for almost 2 years on a variety of approaches to this issue that we hoped would bring the music industry to the table to see if there might be a path forward. And we have been completely rebuffed in doing that. So I would certainly welcome the leadership of this committee in initiating that conversation, because I think it's extremely important to all of the parties
Mr.
represented.
Legette, I think when you say you're rebuffed, it sounds like there's no meeting of minds yet. So I would ask the other side, what is it that, what do we need to do to come up with a situation that's a win-win for all involved?
Well, in answer to your first question, I'm a bass player. I believe that the truth is always in the middle. There's always a way to get everybody to the middle if people are willing to participate in a functional fashion. That did not happen with the Music Modernization Act. But I absolutely can say on behalf of the musicians that I'm representing in the AFM, yes, of course, we are willing to sit down and have a reasonable discussion, but it has to be a reality-based, reasonable discussion about how we're going to fix this, because to just kick the can down the road for another 70 or 100 years is not an acceptable solution. But we're ready to talk, but it has to be realistic. We have to be able to actually move and not just talk about moving towards each other. And I hope that we can do that. I'm certainly going to do everything in my power.
Any other comments from the panelists? Barry?
I would like to take this on as well. Something Mr. Legette said earlier, I think needs to be demystified. He was talking about the payments that radio stations make for the rights to play songs to composers and publishers, the publishing rights or PRO rights. And I got the sense from his testimony that he thought that there should be a redistribution of one pie that would also include the artists and also include the sound recording artists. But that is completely antithetical to the way the world operates. In every other industrialized economy, we have parallel rights and parallel institutions that recognize the fact that these are supportive rights. They're not supposed to be interfered with one another. So the right that we're looking for is not one that's already there. It's one that has never been perceived by the radio industry. And I think it's high time now that we sit down and talk about not the right, because that should be established, but the rate, and that can be determined by a copyright board that will listen to both sides.
Congressman, my focus, based on what I've heard here, is ensuring that dollars get in the pockets of the artists who are asking for it. And my frustration is that there's so many elements of the system right now that are pulling dollars out of the pie. You look at the first 4 pages of Mr. Mussarsky's testimony, and you see the various ways that dollars are being spent by the music industry away from incenting creation. I want to be at the table helping to ensure that artists get their fair share.
And if I may, in the last few seconds that I have, I would encourage all parties involved to sit down and figure this out. For full disclosure, I have a family member, one of my sons, that's a creator. And so, I have kind of a conflict of interest here, but I want to make sure that he's well compensated at the same time that some of these channels are still here. Boo, you have something in my last 4 seconds. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to make it clear that the previous negotiations with the NAB and the quote unquote music industry was a business deal. It was not involving Congress. Only Congress can change the law. And this is about copyrights and the law. It's not about some backdoor deal, business deal between the NAB and record companies. Only Congress can change the law. And I'm an American citizen. I believe in my Congress, and I expect my Congress to believe in me and represent my rights and interests.
The time of the gentleman
Thank you
has
very
expired.
much for everybody for your presentations today.
Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses here today. And thank you to my colleague and friend, Mr. Deutsch, for his leadership on this issue. As you all know, or may know, I'm from Texas. I'm a proud Latina. And for us, in the district that's 77% Latino, we may listen to Frank Sinatra, but we also listen to Trio Los Panchos and Vicky Carr. We do listen to oldies but goodies, and some may think of the Beach Boys, but I still think, Gloria, of the Miami Sound Machine, and I still have all the cassettes. I haven't transitioned to any of your CDs, I regretfully, but so for us, it's Tejano music, it's salsa, it's cumbias, it's a lot of different things. And I think one thing that there's some concern in my area is, what will this do to Spanish radio? What will this do to the many minorities and communities in Houston and Harris County, where we speak 145 languages, 145 languages. 31% of us speak Spanish, but we have a very, very diverse community. What will this do, Gloria? What will this do to those smaller radio stations where communities rely on so many things, and it is part of what builds our community?
Well, what I can tell you is this: what's in the act now, were it to be passed, were that these small stations, and by the way, I think we need to differentiate between a local station, because some of these conglomerates, the big ones, are considered local stations because they happen to be local, but they are part of a very big web of radio stations that make a lot of money. If you make less than $1.5 million a year and more than 100,000, you would only be paying $500 for the entire year of playing any music you want. If you make less than $100,000, you would only pay $10 for the entire music that you would pay in the year. So like streaming, the amounts may be minuscule, but what's important about passing this act is that it's establishing the fact that the performance rights of the performers are equally entitled to compensation, however small it's going to be, because let's not make a mistake here. It's not that all of a sudden this is going to be passed and people are going to be, money is going to come pouring in. This is going to be little amounts. Like you said, there's a lot of local stations and we love radio. Radio cannot go away. We don't want that to happen. That's why the act has made sure, this American Fairness Act has made sure that these stations aren't unduly taxed or, brought under a lot of pressure. $500 a year for unlimited music, we probably pay that in subscription services because the most inexpensive one is $4.99 a month. So, and not everybody can afford that. So thank the Lord for radio.
There is enough equity in the bill to protect all the small stations.
Absolutely. And the big ones, there's nothing established yet. This would be established by a board of judges and royalty consultants. They would hear both sides of the issue, and they would establish what the ones that make over $1.5 million a year would be paying. And I would imagine, comparing to the Modernization Act, Music Modernization Act, it's not going to be anything that's going to break anyone's bank. It's simply going to establish the fact that performers should share equally in the success of a song, and not just the writer, because some of these incredible performers just didn't happen to write music. It's two different talents. And if you're fortunate enough to have them both, then that's great. But it is just as important. The performer, the writer wouldn't make any money if he didn't have a performer that made the song a hit. So it's important to establish the fact that they need.
I think that we asked the question because we obviously see that in broadcasting radios, I mean, there already is an underrepresentation of minorities in the ownership of many of these stations. So we want the same thing repeated. So you feel good that there's enough equity in the bill for not only the radio stations, but also the songwriters. And, there's an old saying that a rose is a rose is a rose. Mm-hmm. So it's a song, it's a song, it's a song. I mean, every song will get a royalty.
Yes, well, not just the song. The songs get a royalty, but they go to the writer. Who doesn't get on AM/FM, the person that doesn't get any money is the singer, if they weren't the writer, or the performers that created that track. It won't
matter what genre. I mean, somebody who writes a salsa will get the same as your conga.
Absolutely, which is the way that it was before. Now, whatever song gets played the most would benefit from the amount of plays, because that's how Music Modernization Act worked. The kitty gets divided, by the number of plays. Let's say there's $100 and there's 100 songs, whichever song got played the most gets an equitable amount, but everybody that gets played gets something. And I think that's what's important, because up to now, performers haven't received anything from AM/FM radio. And by the way, the broadcast radio gets their bandwidth for free because they were established for that reason. Now people have to pay for their space on digital, which is why a lot of these are subscription services. They really do have to pay for that. And that won't change. I just think it's only fair that
The time has expired. The time
Thank
has
you, Mr.
expired.
Chair. And all our family would always play the conga, so you'd get a lot of royalties from us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to each of our witnesses that are here today, and especially Ms. Estefan. I have to just kind of reiterate what my colleague, Representative Garcia said. I have listened to your music for years, and I'm sure I've listened to music that has been played by each and every one of you, that you've had some part in making the music that we're listening to today. But thank you all for taking the time to come before us. And I thank the committee for just continuing to shine a light today on the importance of this legislation. And I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the American Music Fairness Act bill, which really just kind of levels the playing field for music royalty payments by ensuring that our recording artists, singers, and musicians are all paid their fair share. This bipartisan piece of legislation, it really kind of corrects what we deem as a long overdue inequity in the American economy, securing what is owed to thousands of hardworking artists. And my state of Georgia, which I represent, is home to 969 artists and growing that would immediately benefit from the AMFA. And after 2 years of no touring, for many performers, years during which many of these artists lost significant portions of their expected income, this bill really does help many Americans kind of get back on track, get back on their feet again. And I'm pleased that this bill just really protects our small radio stations, such as those that are in our rural regions, and also college radio stations, by establishing a carve-out, which requires those stations pay as little as $10 a year. I urge my colleagues to please join me in co-sponsoring the American Music Fairness Act and just ensuring that all of our artists and American workers are paid their fair share. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to jump to you very quickly. Can you explain how many individuals go into making a song? I want to really kind of pinpoint that today, because I think it would be helpful for the committee to understand how many artists go into producing the music that we hear on the radio, and therefore how many artists right now just aren't being paid for the work that they're producing.
So each song I produce typically has anywhere from 15 to 20 people, background singers, horn players, string players, the rhythm section. So every song is, there's at least 15 to 20 people on that song. And most of those individuals, they don't tour, they play music in a studio for a living.
So in your testimony, thank you. You also mentioned that the ongoing pandemic continues to disrupt touring and the live music sector, which makes it all more important that artists are able to fully realize the value of their recorded music in order to make a living. Can you please just kind of speak further to the impact of the pandemic on the artist's income?
The pandemic has not only encumbered artist income from touring, but even the session musicians. In my studio, when the pandemic hit, we had sessions from Japan, Canada, from the UK, from Australia. They were all scheduled to come to Royal Studios, and my session musicians were all scheduled to play on those recordings. So when the pandemic hit, that didn't happen. So these musicians that play on records, they weren't able to get paid. And it obviously had an impact on the touring musicians because you couldn't do shows. So everybody's income was adversely affected. My income was affected. I couldn't rent the studio. I couldn't produce music. And we're all still struggling to recuperate from that. And we haven't yet.
And I absolutely love Bruno Mars. So how many individuals really helped to record the hit song Uptown Funk, and have any of them received performance royalties from the terrestrial radio?
There's at least 20 individuals on that song, and no one has received any terrestrial radio royalties. From Cameron Whalum, who is a Memphian, Jeff Basker, who lives in LA, he's playing keyboards, and one of the producers. Just none of the session musicians. Steve Jordan is playing drums on it. He's a New York native. None of these musicians have been paid for the millions and potentially billions of broadcasts of that song.
The time of the gentlelady has expired, Mr. Stanton.
Thank you.
Mr. Stanton? Ms. Dean?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and the whole committee for bringing together this group of people I admire, have followed for decades, and some of whom I didn't understand I was admiring and following. So it's a delight to be with you and to learn about this area of our life. Radio is so important. Music is so important, has been in my life, my family, my entire life. Ms. Estefan, as I was preparing last night and reading over the testimony, I hope you'll forgive me. I am a huge fan, admirer of your work and your commitment to art. And I think of you, whenever I think of you and your music, I certainly think of performance, but I think of instruments and sound and your words and of course your voice. And all of those who make that possible. I think it would help the committee to understand some more things, some very tangible things. One of the things that's been talked about is the value of exposure that AM and FM radio provides. But can you talk to that issue of exposure? Obviously, you're in one position. Many of the other performers are in different positions. Can you talk about the issue of exposure, particularly when we're playing oldies? And is it enough to support the background musicians and engineers who add to your music?
It may have been at one time where they paid at any moment. They've never been paid, that this royalty never existed. Absolutely, radio was crucial in my career. Absolutely, there's no two ways about it. And as a matter of fact, the first time we played Conga on Johnny Carson, you were guaranteed a top 10 hit the next day because he was considered a kingmaker. And so many people saw you on that show that you were pretty much guaranteed a top 10 record the next day. But what is the difference? My musicians may have made money when we sold a record, but now there is no more sales of records, CDs, vinyls a little bit because it's come back. It's very popular on young kids. My grandson listens to vinyls because he finds it very romantic to put it on the turntable and put a needle on it. But the advent of new music has been wonderful because now the consumer can choose whatever they want to hear. When you listen to radio, the advertisers kind of choose what you're hearing because they're the ones that are paying for these things. And even in my day, a lot of the people that didn't want to play my music at the beginning was because advertisers didn't think that it would sell to their audience. And we were convinced that it would. So we had a battle there. But there has never been an established fee to be paid for performers for performance on AM FM radio. Only the writer got that. And yes, by the way, writers also benefited because if you got Dionne Warwick, let's say, when Burt Bacharach did Walk On By, when he got Dionne Warwick with that unique voice to sing Walk On By, and he got other artists to do his music, he was more in demand as a writer. Yes. But the performers never got the music, never got the money for the airplay on terrestrial radio.
Well, I go back long enough to remember and prize how I would save money to go down to the local store and buy a 45 and how exciting it was to do that. And then, of course, to albums and all the rest. So I'm one of the old school. And so I'm just delighted to be a part of this conversation today. Mr. Mitchell, you and your work and your family, you said that more than 24 people are credited with recording Uptown Funk. What would performance royalties from that song alone, how would it make a difference in the life of a musician or an artist like you or others who performed or part of Uptown Funk? How would it make a difference?
For a radio hit like Uptown Funk, the impact would simply be enormous. It would probably increase all of our tax brackets if we receive that income that Uptown, that such a huge global hit. It would mean hundreds of thousands of dollars to the backing musicians, to the producers, to the engineers.
And it's not as though others didn't profit from the sale and recording and playing of that song. Is that correct?
That's correct. The songwriters profited. Mr. Mars and Mark Ronson, the artists, profited from sales. But
and also the radio stations who play it.
And also the radio stations who play it, because people listen to radio because of the music they play. They don't listen to radio because of the ads they play. If they want to hear top 40, they go to a top 40 station. If they want to hear pop, they go to a pop station. And it's, we're saying, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I see my time has expired, but I also see Mr. Pomeroy's hand is up. I know I'm not able to take advantage of that. So maybe one of the next questioners will give you the chance, Mr. Pomeroy, to contribute to that question. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, to the distinguished panel of witnesses. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to aid this committee to work in its work and to share your views on the American Music Fairness Act. To the chair and to Chair Johnson, thank you for holding this hearing today. Mr. Chairman, I know this is an issue that you have worked on for many years, and I'm pleased that we are taking time to gather information and to study this issue closely. Briefly, Mr. Pomeroy, did you want to answer that last question?
Well, thank you. I just wanted to say that, when it comes to this money and what's going to happen with it, musicians constantly have to upgrade their gear and purchase new gear to record with. And that is this would allow us to invest in ourselves and allow us to keep moving the music forward as opposed to going backwards. And I just wanted to make sure that you understand that when this money comes in, it's going right back out to the American economy and helping everyone and helping us take the music to the next level so we can stay in front of the rest.
Thank you, Mr. Pomeroy. Appreciate that answer. When I'm in Washington, D.C., I often listen to my local Phoenix, Arizona radio stations. I generally use an app like TuneIn to do that. I believe that when radio stations simulcast their broadcasts over the internet, they are required to pay performance rights to artists. Mr. Legette, if Congress were to move the American Music Fairness Act, would we be setting up radio stations to pay a double fee?
Thank you for the question. Yes, you would be. And I know there's a lot of discussion here about how much the economics have changed for the music industry. No doubt that it has, but there are just so many financial pressures here that that's a fee that's unsustainable for the vast majority of stations if they want to keep doing the level of local investment that they're doing today.
I really want to better understand how much of a royalty such as the one proposed would directly benefit artists. I understand that royalties in sound recordings are generally collected by Sound Exchange and distributed to artists, music labels, and other rights holders. This is a question for Mr. Pomeroy or Mr. Mussarsky. Can you explain what percentage of royalties would actually go to artists, or alternatively, what percentage of those royalties would go to other groups like record labels?
Right. Well, a good example would be the American Music the AFM SAG-AFTRA Fund, which takes the money that is generated and paid to Sound Exchange, which is close to $1 billion a year. When they pay out, 50% goes to the label and the copyright owner, 45% goes to the artist and the producer if the producer has made a deal with the artist to participate. 5% is what goes to backing musicians and backing vocalists. Last year, we distributed over $60 million to over 400 individuals who played on those. Actually, excuse me, that number 400 is low. But, you know, we distributed $62 million based on the airplay of these songs. This is a living wage when you spread it that thin. And that's the model which we would expect AM/FM performance royalties to be based on.
All right, Ms. Mussarsky, I want a chance to answer the same question.
Oh, it was well answered by Mr. Pomeroy. I just want to emphasize that this is a benefit that will be equally distributed between the artists and the labels. And we have wonderful experience with Sound Exchange on how that distribution does take place. We have no concern about it because other jurisdictions have acknowledged the same 50-50 split. So as well, and so had ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. So the artists would get roughly half of that total, and the sound recording owners would roughly get the remaining.
My final question is also for Mr. Legette. For broadcasters subject to the full royalty, this may be a substantial additional expense. Based on your experience in the industry, how do you think most broadcast stations would compensate for those additional expenses?
I think it would undermine the investment in boots on the ground localism. And one of the themes of this hearing is talking about some of the consolidation that's gone on in the broadcast space. I would say, though, that we still remain one of the most competitive dispersed industries in media. You know, as Mr. Mussarsky says in his own testimony, 20 groups occupy 65% of the industry revenues. There's no industry as diversified as that. But these economic pressures are real, and I think you're going to see more consolidation. We are competing for advertising dollars with the Googles, Facebooks, Amazons, Apples of the world. And there's just, this is going to take away from our investment in your community.
All right, ran out of time here, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The time has expired. This concludes today's hearing. We thank all our witnesses for participating. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.